True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
That Debora wasn't the easiest person in the world to live with. She was, I don't want to say, well, let's just leave it at that.
When they met in our kind of entryway there, she just turns on him like for a minute I kind of hold her like I think she's going to physically attack him, and she spits at him. And then she says, "You're going to get these kids over their dead bodies."
The heat was tremendous. There was no way that anyone could even get close to the house. Of course, the flames were roaring out, probably 20 to 30 feet.
Oh, God, beautiful Tim and beautiful Julie are both dead? Jesus Christ, did they make any attempt at all to save them? Christ, I saved one of the kids, and I could have gotten the second one out and didn't. Will never forgive myself for that.
It's fair to say that Debora Green was a suspect early on. It's fair to say that Mike Farrar was a suspect early on.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick. Good evening.
Killers don't wear name tags telling us who they are. They look like everybody else. They are fathers, brothers, neighbors, carpenters, doctors, men, women. On an upper-class suburban street in Kansas City at 7517 Canterbury Court, Dr. Debora Green and her husband, Dr. Michael Farrar, lived with their 3 children. It was a beautiful home where the children were provided with every advantage. Michael made a generous salary as a cardiologist. Debora was a full-time mother. So this was the image of the perfect family. Now, when the family's home became engulfed in flames on October 23, 1995, Debora was barely able to escape the fire. Tragically, 2 of her children perished in the fire. When the fire was determined to be caused by arson, police were looking for a murderer, but they were searching for a murderer from a pool of people who seemed very unlikely to be murderers, and it seemed unimaginable that anyone would have wanted to kill 2 innocent children. What was uncovered at the investigation that followed would shock the community and invite speculation from all over the world. Join us at the quiet end today as we relive the lives of an outwardly successful couple, following the twists and turns marked by love, fraud, addiction, infidelity, madness, attempted murder, and finally murder. In this episode of True Crime Brewery, first, do no harm.
I like how you invoke the Hippocratic Oath there.
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you. What do we have to drink for this episode?
We have a barley wine. This is Old Bacchus barley wine, brewed by Free State Brewing Company in Lawrence, Kansas. So barley wines are big, strong, intense beers. They tend to be sweet and very alcoholic. They're amber to dark brown, fruity. This is an American barley wine, which tends to be a little more alcoholic and hoppy than English barley wines. So this particular one is a nice, pretty copper color with a bright white head. Has an aroma of caramel and fruit. The taste is caramel and raisins, maybe a little toffee showing up there. Very strong, bold beer. Good one. Sip it carefully.
Okay, thanks.
So, Julie, let's take our beer and our snifters, head on down to the quiet end.
Okay. Is the snifter normally the glass that you would drink a barley wine out of?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, you can drink a barley wine out of most anything.
But not a pint glass?
Well, even a pint glass.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know how I feel about snifters.
Yes. So we'll take the snifters, go on down. I'm ready.
Okay. So it was after midnight when the Kansas winds first blew waves of fire and dark smoke from the walls and windows of the 5,000 square foot home at 7517 Canterbury Court. Debora Green ran to her neighbor's house and banged on the front door. When she looked back at her house, which was now ablaze with fire, she saw her daughter Kate perched on the edge of a roof that was quickly giving way. Kate was screaming for help as she saw her mother through the dark black smoke. Now, Debora stood below the roof, opened her arms. She told Kate to jump. Kate wasn't real excited about doing that, but she did.
Well, yeah, she had flames at her back.
It was either that, jump or die.
Right, pretty much.
So she jumped. Debora didn't catch her, Kate landing on the ground in front of her. But amazingly, she wasn't injured.
Well, those little kids, they bounce.
I guess. So Kate clung to her mother as the police and fire trucks arrived. She screamed at the firemen and the police to save her brother and sister and the 2 dogs. Her mother must have been in shock as she was staring blankly at the inferno that had been her home. Every mother's nightmare.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, maybe some background on Dr. Greene.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Now, Joanne Purdy and Robert Jones were newlyweds when they settled back in Havana, Illinois, and the population there was just over 4,000 citizens. It was a typical farming community. Joanne and Bob had married young. Joanne was barely 18, and Bob was a year younger than her.
Boy, I guess that's young.
Yeah, about as young as you can get.
Yeah. Now this is...
Without parental permission, I guess.
60 years ago. And we're in a rural farming community, so I guess it wasn't such a big deal.
No, but Joanne was really a smart student. She'd won a scholarship to Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri. So she had higher hopes. People thought she was going to go places. So she did enter her freshman year, even though Bob didn't want her to go.
Well, no, he's in love with her.
Well, yeah. And she didn't fit in at the college because most of her classmates were wealthier and they were well-dressed. I guess at the time they wore pearls and skirts and, she had farm girl clothing.
Right.
And she quickly became very homesick. She missed Bob, and he was still in high school because he was a year younger.
Yep.
So she dropped out, predictably, and said yes to Bob's marriage proposal. Bob was a good-looking guy. He had thick, wavy black hair. He was only 5'6", but he was muscular and tan. He was pretty cute. And they married back on Halloween 1948. Joanne let go of her dream of becoming a teacher then, and she became pregnant with her first child. Now, their first daughter, Pamela, was born in 1949, and then Debora was born in 1951. The Joneses' marriage seemed happy. Joanne stayed home with the girls, and Bob worked. Now, both Pamela and Debora were exceptionally intelligent girls, but Debora was the genius. She taught herself how to read when she was only 2.5.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. Now, Bob was easygoing, and Joanne was determined that her daughters were going to go to college and have their own careers. Not unlike a lot of mothers, she wants to live through her children the dreams that she let go. Now, if she got upset with them or became verbally abusive, which it was told that she did, it was usually because of schoolwork or something like that. She demanded excellence from them and high grades. And Debora, the genius, was the lazier student, but it didn't matter because she could make straight A's with no effort, which that makes me really jealous. That is such a gift to be able to do that.
Yeah, although at some point you're not going to be making straight A's all the time.
Without effort.
Without effort.
Right. And I think she realized that when she gets to college.
Right.
Yeah. But in high school, she had no problem.
Oh, yeah. Just breeze on through.
Right. Now, throughout her life, Debora would define herself by her scholastic accomplishments and her intellect. She excelled also in the piano and violin lessons she took, and she played them in college as well.
Yeah, now, her sister Pam was the prettier of the 2 kids. She had softer features where Debora had a more solid, square face, but Debora had that nice, thick, wavy auburn hair that everybody envied.
Yeah, that was the style in the 60s or whenever, the long hair with the part down the middle.
Yep.
And she had gorgeous hair, they said.
Beautiful hair. So Dad, Bob, is getting promoted at his place of work. He's doing pretty well. So
that was good, yep.
The family moved to Metamora, Illinois, when Pam was a senior in high school.
Yeah, but they only lived there for 2 years. through Deborah's sophomore and junior years.
Right. Then Bob got him promoted again, and they moved to Peoria.
Right.
This was a little more difficult because they're moving from a town of 5,000 to a city with almost 200,000 people.
But Deborah had no problem, which is unusual because most high school girls or boys have trouble moving in high school.
At that age, it's a tough age to move.
It is, but it didn't seem to really affect her. She did well.
Yep, she did. Well, she was very popular in the class of 1969 at Peoria High School. She had a great sense of humor, was clever and witty, could turn anything into a joke. But she never wavered from her academic path. She didn't drink, she didn't take drugs. She liked reading classics and history books. But her main focus was science and math.
Which was pretty unusual in the 60s for a woman to go that way.
Isn't it?
Yeah, because those were male-dominated professions.
They certainly were. Now, at the same time, even though she's looking mostly at science and math, she's also a cheerleader.
Yeah, which is impressive. That's hard work.
She was on the student council and was a National Merit Scholar. So she dated a guy named Greg Short for 2 years while in high school. They went to the prom together. Greg was head over heels in love with her.
Yes, he was. She was a beautiful young girl. She might not have had the features of Pam, but she looked pretty good. She was thin, she had the beautiful hair, and she was so accomplished and witty.
She was.
She was really kind of a catch back then.
So Deb was co-valedictorian, never getting anything less than an A for her whole high school career. She had nearly perfect SAT scores and was accepted at the University of Illinois. Now
Right, but that's not that hard to get into.
No.
No.
It's a state school.
Right.
You know?
But maybe she didn't apply to any
Possibly not.
more difficult schools. But I would think she'd be able to get into Duke or, some of the elite schools.
Yeah, I would have thought.
But maybe she didn't think of that. And she doesn't come from a family of academics, so.
No.
And that might have been more convenient. They were from Illinois.
Right,
So.
they lived in Peoria, so they have in-state tuition.
True. And the dad drove a bread truck, so even though he was doing well at his job, he was far from wealthy.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he was moving up.
He was moving up.
But, yeah. And Deb just did beautifully at the University of Illinois. However, she got her first B and was very upset with that. So,
Well, that's tough for people who are that much of a perfectionist and have gotten A's all their life.
Isn't it?
It is, which is ridiculous to me. Because to me, A's and B's are fine. There's no need to do better than that, but that's my mindset, I guess.
Yeah, well, I see these kids all the time in my practice that are so driven. They can't get anything other than an A, and they get almost physically ill when they don't get an A.
See, that worries me.
And doesn't it?
Because life is so full of failures and ups and downs, they're not really set up to deal with it then. I think it makes them less able to deal with life, which is difficult as you grow up.
Life is difficult anyway.
Right, exactly.
So as she gets to the end of her first year in college, Deb and Greg had drifted apart. He was in community college, and Deborah didn't think he was smart enough for her.
So a bit of a snob, maybe.
Yeah.
She kind of thinks she's better than others. And she had plans to become a chemical engineer, which is a very elite major, I believe. You have to be really smart, especially in the 60s. Now, she had no real interest in medicine, but at the time there was an excess of engineers, and Deborah was encouraged to choose a different major. So she chose chemistry, pre-med, and she graduated with that degree in less than 3 years.
Yeah, so there's her high-powered drive. She finished college in 3 years instead of 4.
Yeah, so she must have been piling on the courses.
Must have been.
So she went to med school at the University of Kansas Medical School in 1972, but her friends, her family, everyone would say her heart really just wasn't in it. In her anatomy class, though, she met another student named John Hacker, and they became friends as they worked over the same cadaver in a group of 4 students. So I guess they had groups, and then each group gets their own cadaver to use throughout the semester. Is that how it works?
That's how we did it.
Okay.
Yeah, there were four people per cadaver.
Okay. So John Hacker was in her group, which will be important later on because John will come back into her life later. That's why I mention it.
He will.
So Deborah was able to finish medical school in 3 years, And she had her MD in 1975, so I'm impressed.
Yeah, here she is, 8 years of school done in 6.
Exactly. And tough school. Not easy.
Exactly.
So when she did her internships, the emergency medicine rotation was her favorite. But after spending more time working in the ER, she became bored and kind of disappointed with it, because most of the patients coming in had mundane complaints that should have been taken care of with their general practitioner. Sore throats, earaches, things like that.
Yeah, you're not always busy saving lives in the ER.
No, and that's kind of what she'd hoped for.
Yeah, a little more action.
Yeah. And then for some reason I can't decipher, she decided to go into oncology, saying that she was a real people person. But from what I've read about her, I would say she's not a people person at all.
No, she certainly isn't.
No.
And oncology, you're going to lose a lot of patients.
Right. Well, she found that out. And later on, she said it was too depressing, and she left oncology as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we'll find out that she kind of drifts around in medicine, different fields and stuff. Just never finds a niche.
Yeah, well, her heart wasn't in it, and I don't think it was for her.
No.
So that was a big failure, and I'm sure it was a difficult failure for someone who's so driven.
I would think so, right?
Right.
So while she's at the University of Illinois, she met and dated an engineering student named Dwayne Green, and they got married while she was in med school. Debora looked beautiful at the wedding with her long hair parted down the middle and wearing a willowy white dress.
Yeah, I thought she looked beautiful. You're making a little face. You didn't think she looked beautiful?
And she was okay.
Well, I mean, she wasn't a gorgeous woman.
No.
But she looked nice. We'll say nice. We don't have to say beautiful. But She looked like a nice bride. She didn't look bad.
Yeah. And Dwayne was a big, tall guy with huge sideburns and those big handlebar-type mustaches that were pretty popular back in the day.
Oh, yeah, my dad had that. The big sideburns that went all across the cheek, like the Elvis sideburns.
You got it.
And the big mustache. Oh, yeah, that was the thing.
So Deb's parents went to their small wedding, and to her mother, Deb's future couldn't have been brighter.
No, Joanne is living through her daughters. It's making Joanne happy.
Yeah.
That's her thing.
Because remember, she's a pretty intelligent woman also, and she demanded excellence from her daughters. So now her youngest daughter is getting married. She's a doctor or becoming a doctor. Big stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Pretty proud.
Right, marrying an engineer who's successful, so that's great.
Yeah. But the marriage got off to a troubled start. Or became troubled pretty soon.
Well, Deborah would say they really didn't have any common interests.
No.
Which I guess can happen. You're just in this young passion and you realize, well, who the hell am I with? If you go too fast, that's why you need to get to know somebody.
That would work, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
No, she was a doctor, but she was very negative about engineering. She said that engineers are boring and they don't communicate well.
Which is funny because that's what she wanted to be. So She must have had some resentments.
I think so. So Dwayne and Deborah separated in the 1970s, the late 70s. And Deborah really enjoyed her freedom.
Yeah, this was kind of a wild, fun time for her.
I guess.
Because she hadn't done that. She'd always been hitting the books really hard.
Right. It sounds like she's cutting loose.
Yes, she took trips all over the world, and she had a lot of boyfriends. She was slender, she had the beautiful wavy hair, and she worked extra shifts to increase her income. She bought herself a Jaguar XKE to drive around Kansas City and Independence, and she was vibrant, successful, and energetic by all accounts. She was like the it girl for a while there.
She was. Now, during this time, when she's divorced and living it up, she met Michael Farrar, who was a medical student beginning his senior year with an emergency room rotation at Truman Medical Center. He was 4 years younger than Deborah, and he found her very exciting.
Well, she was attractive, bright, and she had that wit.
Yeah.
And he would say she was the smartest woman he'd ever met.
And she thought Mike was a good-looking guy, and he's a good person. She saw him as a stable man, helped make her feel safe. Another doctor, or a doctor-to-be.
Yeah.
Maybe more on equal footing with her.
I think it's important to her that professional success.
Yes.
Having money, too, seems like a priority to her.
When she and Mike first started to date, she still wasn't officially divorced from Dwayne.
Yeah, and she didn't tell Mike about that right away either.
No.
No, but she broke it to him later.
Well, fortunately.
When the divorce was final, Dwayne said that he really felt as if he'd just been a convenience for Debora. He'd helped her pay her bills through med school, and then she dumped him.
Yeah.
Now, he could have just been a resentful guy, who knows? But that was his thought, was she was kind of cold and used him, and then it was it.
Yeah, now Mike and Debora didn't have a very passionate relationship.
I don't think she was a very passionate person. She didn't seem to be very sensual or passionate about any of the men she was with.
No, the picture that's portrayed her, she's portrayed as being kind of unfeeling.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And maybe worse as time goes on.
Yeah. So Mike is 23, finishing med school, doesn't have much money. He's impressed with Deb and her success. It wasn't until after they were together for a while that he realized that Deb was actually quite insecure.
Yeah, she was threatened by the close relationship he had with his family. And then when he met her family, they seemed cold, especially Joanne. So Debora seems like she's really her mother's daughter. They're very similar.
Yes.
Except Debora did go to school. But they're both kind of, can I say cold bitches? Is that going too far?
Well,
They seem bitchy.
Okay. I think I could leave it at cold.
Yeah, but they actually seem bitchy. Like, tough to be around,
yeah,
really.
The more you get to know them from what we've been looking at, yeah, the bitchier they become.
Oh, yeah, I mean, when it gets to the point where we're getting to the fire, they're total bitches. I'm not even hesitating there. But I think they start out pretty bitchy. And definitely cold, yes. Cold people.
Yeah.
Cold ladies. So before they got married, Mike and Debora had lived together in a small apartment. And they didn't have a passionate sex life, he said, but they were both working such long hours. He's in med school. She's, what, a resident?
Yeah, isn't she?
I think so.
She wasn't an attending yet.
No. So they're both really busy.
Yeah.
Plus she's working extra, I guess. So he thought, well, we're just so tired, we don't have time for each other. That's why our relationship really doesn't have a sex life that's on fire.
Right. And he had some doubts also about her explosive temper, which he got to witness firsthand a few times.
Yeah, he witnessed it before the marriage, so maybe he should have not gone through with that looking back.
Hindsight is such a good thing, isn't it?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, she would verbally attack people just because they took a parking spot that she thought was hers, or a waiter bringing the wrong order to the table. She just flipped.
That is the biggest turnoff. If you're out on a date, you go out to dinner, and the person you're with is rude to the wait person, that's a deal breaker. I always tell people that.
It would be.
Especially, they don't even know this person, so how are they going to be with you when you're together all the time for years? It's a bad sign. It's just that they have no tolerance. There's something wrong with that kind of person. And it's embarrassing, too, to be with someone like that.
Yeah, but despite the misgivings, he went ahead with the wedding.
He did. I don't know. I think he was just impressed with the fact that she was successful. She was attractive enough. And she was, she had stuff that he didn't have, right?
Yeah, she did.
She was already getting paid as a career person.
And I think also, I mean, not that it's snobbery on his part, but she's an equal to him.
Well.
So he's not marrying someone beneath him. I think that was important to him.
Okay. So he wanted to marry another professional person.
Yeah.
Which doesn't really work out for him in the end either.
No.
So they had their honeymoon for 2 weeks, right?
In Tahiti. Now,
yeah, I've never been to Tahiti.
That's a pretty good place for a honeymoon.
I would imagine, yeah.
Now, Mike had hoped that the atmosphere in Tahiti would make them closer, but he was soon disappointed. Debora didn't want to make love or even hold hands. She preferred reading novels over being intimate with him. He began to wonder why she'd married him. And the other sticking point to Mike was that she kept her ex-husband's last name, Green. She said this was for professional reasons.
Yeah, what do you think of that decision? To me, it's a little bit odd. I can see keeping your maiden name, but why would you keep an ex-husband's name?
It mystifies me. I don't know. I mean, I guess I can see the point of having her licensing and her board certification and stuff.
I could see that, but how difficult is it to change it? She's still very early in her career.
It's not.
Yeah.
But she didn't. She kept that one.
Yeah, he didn't really like that. He didn't think that was the best thing.
Oh, I wouldn't either. Now, after medical school, Mike did a 3-year residency in internal medicine at the University of Cincinnati. Then he stayed on a 4th year as chief resident and then got a 3-year fellowship in cardiology.
So he's a bright guy.
He's a bright guy and got to be a pretty hard worker to get fellowships.
He was working all the time.
So he's going to be an internal medicine guy who specializes in cardiology.
Right.
So he's done 3 years of internal medicine and then another 3 years of subspecialty work in cardiology.
Yeah, that takes commitment. I just don't think I'd have the patience for that, even if I did have the ethic, the work ethic, and the smarts.
Yes.
That's a lot of endurance.
It sure is. So while they're living in Ohio, Deborah went into private practice in emergency medicine at Jewish Hospital. But she wasn't very popular there. Co-workers thought she was abrasive and very difficult to work with. She got angry and would explode in anger if her judgment was questioned. And back to all the usual mundane cases that come into the ER, they continued to irritate her.
Well, and she wasn't good at hiding her irritation either, was she? I mean,
No.
her bedside manner was, they said it was more confrontational than anything.
Right.
And she always had been disgusted with stupid people, and she felt like she saw a lot of that in the ER.
Well,
And she treated people poorly.
she didn't suffer fools very well.
No, so if you've got uneducated people coming in with a sore throat, you know, because they didn't go to the doctor and it's Friday evening,
Yeah,
that's irritating.
it is. But then
But she
As-
wasn't good at hiding it.
as the patient, you don't need to have some snotty doctor berating you
Oh, God, no.
for showing up with a simple complaint.
No, that doesn't go well.
No.
I mean, I think if you're smart as a physician, you just say, well, and just be happy and take care of the person. That's the way I look at it.
Oh,
But she was
couldn't
angry.
do that.
She was an angry woman.
she was. So Mike's parents tried to bond with Deborah, despite her coldness. When they came to visit them one Christmas, Mike was still at work at the hospital, and Deborah had been reading in the bedroom. When they arrived, Deborah let them in, walked past them back to her bedroom, and they didn't see her again till the next day.
That kills me.
Doesn't it?
Can you imagine?
Your in-laws show up,
Yeah.
and you say, hi, come on in, boom. See you later.
Right. So she was an odd one, right?
More than odd.
Yeah. I mean, I would say Asperger's, but I think she goes way beyond that to, I don't know what, but she definitely has social issues.
I guess.
In the beginning of their marriage, Deborah had all the power. In Cincinnati, the balance of power started to become equal, though, because Mike was rising in his career, and she wasn't doing so great. They seemed to have adjusted, and they had a livable marriage, but it really wasn't happy.
It doesn't
The
sound
relationship,
like it was.
the relationship was lacking.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like they're two people just living together.
Yeah, almost like roommates.
Right. So Mike also was getting concerned that Deborah was using narcotics. He found bottles of Percodan and Tylenol number 3, which is Tylenol with codeine, at their home. They had a patient's name on them from the hospital. When he asked Deb about it, she'd say, oh, yeah, I picked that up when the patient brought his drugs in and I forgot to give it back to him. At first he believed her, but after a few instances he was worried.
Well, yeah, that's kind of odd after a few times. Could happen once, but...
Once, yeah. More than once. Although she's not making any attempt at concealing these things.
Well, I mean, they're not sitting on the counter.
No.
No.
But they're not hidden. I mean, he didn't have to search or ransack the house to find them.
No, at least not at first.
Right.
I mean, there are other times where it gets worse, I think, but, you know, she was complaining about these headaches, and sometimes her speech was slurred, so he started wondering if she was self-medicating. And he could kind of tell something was up because she'd have this staggering gait, she'd kind of walk funny.
Yeah.
And she did go to a neurologist and was diagnosed with migraines. And the neurologist gave her a prescription for beta blockers, which are usually for high blood pressure, right?
Yeah, but they work pretty nicely on migraines.
How does that work?
Well, that's a good question.
Oh, it's just a random thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I thought maybe the blood pressure in your head goes down.
Well, the problem with migraines is they're not very well understood anyway.
Right.
So there's several different types of medications that help migraines. Beta blockers, one of them.
Okay.
And they're generally pretty safe.
Yeah, and that seemed to help. She seemed more normal, and the drug problem seemed to at least subside for a while. Now, they weren't using birth control because they did want to have a family, but sex was pretty infrequent, so it took 2 years of unprotected sex for her to get pregnant. And when she found out she was pregnant, they were both really happy. They'd wanted children. And they had Timothy Farrar in January 1982. And Debora was a really good mother. She took 6 weeks off work because she was a career woman. And she was with him. She breastfed him and spent a lot of time with him. And then she hired this sweet Jamaican woman to be his nanny before she went back to work. Now she had a fellowship to study hematology and oncology at the University of Cincinnati. So she'd gotten tired of the ER. And here's where she's trying out oncology as her next career.
Yes.
So I guess it's a good thing about medicine that you can try these different things, because some careers you can't do that.
No, you can do different fellowships and study different fields. Sure.
Exactly, right. So that was lucky.
They had another child, Kate, who was born in December 1984, so a couple years after Timothy. And they felt like they had a perfect family now. They had a little boy and a little girl. Now, Debora went back to work after being home for 6 weeks. Now, she was doing her fellowship, but wasn't really excited about it, didn't do very well. She took her oncology board exams twice and failed them both times. She hadn't studied, wasn't prepared. Now, this is a far cry from that driven, straight-A student.
Right. She just didn't seem... Well, Mike said she wasn't used to having to study, though.
Yeah.
That he would spend hours and hours on the books, and she didn't really need to pass things usually. But now she's into these really tough tests you need to take to pass the boards.
Right.
Imagine they're very difficult.
They are very difficult.
And she's not studying, so she can't pass. It's not that easy.
And she's pissed off.
She's angry, and she's crying. She calls Mike screaming when she finds out. Because around the same time, he found out that he'd passed his cardiology boards.
Yeah.
That made her even more pissed off.
Right. She's not got the upper hand anymore.
No, I'm sure she didn't like that.
So she never did pass her oncology boards. Now, those are important. It's very, almost essential to be board certified.
Well, she blamed Mike for her failure, saying that she was busy taking care of the kids, but
Right.
He disagreed.
He did.
So how crucial is it to pass the boards?
Well, you can practice a specialty without being board certified. But in terms of referral patterns, I mean, if you're not board certified, you're going to get less referrals.
And maybe groups won't invite you in as yearly?
Right. They won't. And insurances might not pay as well. So there's a host of reasons to be board certified.
Well, she went ahead to practice without it, though, right?
Right.
Well, in 1986, Mike was invited to join a cardiology practice in Kansas City, and the family moved back to that area. And when they were there, they settled in an upscale neighborhood near the country club church. They bought a beautiful house. It had arched doorways and a really large garden. And they were back in the area where they'd met and married, so they were hopeful. Debora stayed home until she found a new nanny. Then she joined another group of physicians. But at the end of her first year, she expected to be offered a partnership, and it didn't happen. So is that what normally happens after you're with a place for a year?
Yeah. If you're doing a reasonably good job, you're going to be offered a partnership.
Well, that didn't happen, and I guess she didn't get along with patients, and the other doctors didn't want her. Also, one of the doctors had expressed some concern over her behavior. He'd called up Mike saying, "What's going on with Debora?" Because she seemed to be on some kind of drugs. She was slurring her words. She was having that staggering walking thing. So she had to leave that practice. So she's not doing well as a physician. She's kind of bouncing around. And
she is.
I imagine your reputation turns to crap after some of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be tough getting hired.
Right. I know that when you've been looking at other doctors to join your practice, that's a big red flag. That you don't want people if you see they've been all over the place. And
I get worried about some people that have been 5 jobs in 10 years type of thing.
Right, exactly.
That's a worrisome thing.
I mean, it can be that they're just not getting along with people, which is probably in most jobs, that's the hardest thing, is just to get along with people. If you can't get along with other people, you really can't succeed in any field.
Right. So Debora solved this problem by opening her own private practice. So it's just her.
Yeah, but she still has to deal with patients, so...
Still has to deal with patients, still has to have coverage.
Yeah, right. Somebody has to be on call for her, right?
Right, because you're not going to be on call every single day.
Well, hopefully not.
Right. Now, she had an old wrist injury, and this continued to bother her. Years back, she had fallen on the steps at the Cincinnati hospital, punctured her knee, and it had gotten infected. So she spent 10 days in the hospital on antibiotics. The infection was cured, but she continued to have knee pain.
And I think she would continue to have that knee pain for years.
Always, yeah.
Which is miserable. I mean, that does seem like a horrible thing to deal with. In the private practice, I guess it was going pretty well in the beginning. But the hospital where she was working closed, and then she got pregnant with their third child, Kelly, and that was unexpected for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, she was in her late 30s, and she thought she was done having children.
But I guess she hadn't done anything to prevent it.
Well, apparently not.
Yeah, so their youngest child, Kelly, was born in December 1988. And everyone loved her, though. Once she was born, they kind of forgot about the unwelcome surprise of it. At least they seemed to. And she was welcomed into the family. She was a cute little thing. And Mike was really proud of how Debora was as a mother to his children. You know, even though they didn't have this passionate relationship, he saw her as a good mother for his children, and that was important for him. She spent a lot of time with the kids. She enrolled them in activities, and she always made special birthday parties for them. She was very involved. But Debora started suspecting that Mike was looking at other women, which isn't surprising if they're not having much passion in their relationship. And she sometimes seemed obsessed with Mike, following him around and checking up on what he was doing. And of course she had her temper tantrums. Those hadn't gone away.
No, in fact, they might have been getting worse.
I would think so. When things didn't go her way, she seemed frustrated and she just really got angry. She'd also put on some weight, which really made her mad because she couldn't lose the weight as easily as she had when she was younger. So after her pregnancy with Kelly, she was overweight, unhappy, not feeling so great.
Right. And the family took a lot of trips together.
That seemed the one time that they could really kind of enjoy each other.
Yeah. They went to Alaska, British Columbia, Puerto Vallarta, and Disneyland. They had a good time on these trips. But travel could be quite stressful.
With Debora, it sure could.
Yeah, she was making scenes at airports on more than one occasion. If there were changes in flights or delays, she'd verbally abuse people, clerks, swearing at them. Very embarrassing.
So these are things that the clerks have no control over. I mean, weather, the plane's getting worked on, something like that. They have no control over it. And she's yelling at them. And this was embarrassing for Mike and for the kids. She's swearing at them. She's also doing this whole, do you know who I am type of thing, bringing up that they're both physicians and that they should be treated better than this. And they're going to complain. And I mean, how embarrassing to be with someone like that. I'd be hiding under the chair.
Wouldn't you?
I would. It's awful.
So Mike was quite the perfectionist. He liked everything to be just so around the house. Debora, on the other hand, was much less organized. She became less conscientious with the household and family plans, and that was difficult for Mike to accept. So she got very sloppy around the house, didn't do housework. They had a cleaning service, but the clean house never lasted more than a few hours with Debora and 3 kids.
Yeah, they were like food wrappers on the ground.
Yeah.
Plus they have a dog that would go on the floor. It was disgusting.
Like they were squatters or something.
Yeah, and just, I wouldn't like that either. And he started to feel like Debora was purposely trying to displease him, like kind of doing it in a angry way. And going out of her way to really act crazy.
Yeah. Her
like
rage.
Passive-aggressive, I guess you'd call it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So her rage just seemed to be a way to control and manipulate him. But she was really making herself more and more dependent on him.
Well, she was, yeah. Because she's not making the money.
No.
She's not really doing stuff on her own. She's home with the kids, which is understandable. There's nothing wrong with being home with the kids. But she's kind of letting things go.
If that's what you want.
Right, but she's also letting herself go physically. She doesn't have interests.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's making her world shrink.
She sure is. Now, she did try to reestablish her practice after Kelly, the last baby, was born. She was on staff at Trinity Hospital, but the competition was fierce, and she failed to bring in enough patients to warrant keeping her on staff. So in 1989, she decided to forego any more career in medicine, and she's going to stay home and be a mom.
And Mike was okay with that. He actually encouraged her. She never seemed happy as a physician, he said, and she seemed depressed. So despite her intelligence and her outward success, she couldn't see anything positive in her life except her children. And I guess this is when she started escaping more and using drugs. Again. I mean, Mike could recognize the signs by this time. He'd seen them before. She'd get this kind of funny look on her face and a slur to her speech. After confronting her, he found her stash of drugs also. There were quite a few, hidden away this time. He guessed that she must have been calling in prescriptions for patients and then picking them up herself. Which, that's a big no-no, right? You don't want to be doing that.
No, ma'am. You definitely don't want to be doing that.
But not all of them could be filled with a phoned-in prescription either, so she must have been pretending to be a patient and going in with a prescription. So wow, she's really flirting with trouble here.
Yeah, I believe that's against the law.
I would think so. She had a medical license still, but she didn't have any real patients. So her self-esteem was probably at this time at an all-time low. And I almost feel kind of sad for her at this point. And Mike said that he felt sorry for her. But he did warn her she had to stop doing this or she was going to end up in jail.
She for sure would be.
And definitely that medical license would be taken away.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. And this seemed to scare her. There were no more signs of drug use after he talked to her. And he remembered that throughout their marriage, Debora had an inordinate number of accidents. She had the knee injury, the wrist injury. She had a finger that became infected after it was bitten by a patient. And she had this wrist injury which seemed to have repeated complications. And none of her injuries ever healed quickly, and they all required medication. So then he wondered if Debora had been suffering from Munchausen syndrome because he hadn't considered that before. But she kind of has the symptoms.
A little bit.
So what's Munchausen syndrome? We've talked about Munchausen by proxy, so just give us a quick idea.
Well, Munchausen syndrome is feigning illness or injury in order to get attention.
Right, but you're actually injuring yourself. So it's not like hypochondria. What's the difference there?
No, those hypochondriacs have imaginary things.
Right.
But so you could cut your knee or something like that and let it get infected.
Well, because it was kind of funny to fall on the steps and get a puncture wound.
Right.
That's odd.
Yeah.
And so maybe she was doing it so she'd have an excuse to use the drugs.
Possibly. I mean, there wasn't that much time spent discussing Munchausen syndrome in the book, so I'm not sure how important that was.
No, but it's a consideration. I think it's possible.
Well,
I don't know if you'd call it Munchausen's, but I definitely think she probably would have injured herself to be having the drugs and the attention.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Yeah. So she did take another job at the Missouri Patient Care Review Foundation, and it was meticulous, tedious work, reviewing charts. So that seemed like a good fit for Debora. And she seemed pretty successful at the job, but actually, we would find out that she wasn't at all. Her reviews were being reviewed because she was having trouble with people in the office. And the Missouri Patient Care Review Foundation had to downsize and consolidate their regional offices to one office in Jefferson City, Debora said. So she told Mike that they were going to put her in charge of the whole operation, but she had to turn it down because of his practice in Kansas City. And we don't know if that could be true. I mean, Mike really doubted that story, but he never did anything to confirm it. But if she was having trouble there, it seems not that likely that they were wanting to put her in charge of the whole thing.
It doesn't seem very likely at all.
That would be a passive-aggressive way to throw things in his face, to say he was holding her back.
Yeah.
Because she really seemed to be looking for excuses why she wasn't a successful doctor.
Exactly. She went on to do freelance work where she'd review Medicaid files sent to her from various states. Now, this is something she could do at home, so she was free to take the kids to their lessons and sports practices and so on.
That sounds like the ideal job for a mom.
Yeah. Plus, she didn't have to deal with other people.
Good for Debora, yeah.
So Mike thought that was pretty good. They didn't need the money, but it was nice to have, and it was nice to have her home for the kids.
Yeah, so she did stay home, and she actually joined a tennis club. And some of the women who played tennis with her said that she really was a wonderful mother. She did everything with her kids. But other people would say she was kind of abusive. She would badmouth other kids at soccer games, and she was uncomfortable to be around. And she probably had some depression. She was a full-time stay-at-home mom. She had this messy house and a very distant marriage. And her appearance had made a radical change over these years. She had put on some weight before, but now she'd gained 40 to 50 pounds on her 5'4" frame. It's a good amount of weight. She looked 5 or 10 years older than her early 40s, which she was. And in contrast, Mike, who was 4 years younger, he looked like a young guy. He looked like he was still in his early 30s. He's out there around other women. It's a tough time. And Debora had also cut off all her hair into the kind of a masculine haircut that wasn't very flattering. She wore thick glasses. She didn't use her contacts anymore. She didn't make any efforts to put on makeup or to dress up. So she wore unisex t-shirts and these too tight mom jeans. So she kind of seemed to have given up. And I don't know, I feel like she's at home taking care of the kids. Give her a break. She doesn't need to be putting on makeup every day. But it seems like she never tried. Like they never went out to dinner. She never tried to, not just for her marriage, but for her own self-esteem. Yeah. She didn't really put any efforts forth.
You get the impression she's basically given up.
Yeah, at least on that part of her life. She did still seem involved with the kids' lives, though. So yeah. Kind of like her mom, Joanne, she's living through her children.
Right. Now, Mike was very focused on his career, and he's doing quite well in cardiology. But he is also determined to make his marriage work. He tried to deal with Debora's rages. She would sometimes beat herself about the head or on her thighs until she left bruises.
So that's weird behavior.
It is.
What's that indicative of? Anything? Some kind of mental illness?
Depression.
And now in public, these rages were mortifying for the kids. Can you imagine your mother beating on herself in public?
Yeah. Or screaming at other people. I mean...
It's horrible.
Yes.
It's tough. So
Mike got to leave home in the morning to make rounds. It became an escape, good relief for him. So
yeah, he was happy to leave in the morning.
He was. He threw himself into his career so he didn't have to think about his marriage. And he did notice other women.
Sure he did. I'm sure he did.
Women who spoke softly, did not yell at him, or stomp around in rages.
That would be enticing.
It would, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you might want to be around a woman who's nice to you once in a while. I could see that.
I would too. But he didn't recognize that Debora's behavior could be dangerous. And he remained determined to keep his vows. He's going to get this marriage to last. He wanted Debora to change. So rather than have an affair, he preferred to be at home with his children. He just wanted the marriage to be better, or at least bearable.
Yeah, but then Debora had begun to use the children as allies in their fights. They're fighting more, and she's pulling the kids to her side. When she's angry, which is often, she complained to Tim about it, their oldest, and she would speak to Tim as if he were an adult. It was very inappropriate. So Mike and Tim had a really strained father-son relationship, as you can imagine. And as Tim got older, that only became worse. And then the good times became fewer and farther apart. Debora wouldn't even encourage Tim to obey his father. She treated him more like a brother than a son, and she really fostered a dysfunctional family situation. She told all of their kids what a bad father Mike was, and they began to side with her. Now she began yelling and screaming daily. At first, Mike shouted back at her, but he soon learned that only made the situation worse. And so soon he began to ignore her, and he gave up on reasoning with her. He began to leave the house for an hour or two, and then before you know it, he's leaving for a day, before he feels like it's safe to go home and have peace. So by 1994, Mike had decided he wanted to leave the marriage for good.
Yes, he's reached that breaking point. He didn't feel like he could stay in this marriage any longer. Everyone would be happier if he were to remove himself from the home. Mike's depressed. He's convinced that things were not going to improve. They'd been married 12 years, and the marriage had only gotten worse with time. Now, Debora says she was shocked when Mike asked for a divorce in 1994. She claimed to have not noticed how unhappy they were. But she'd been telling the people she played tennis with that her husband was having an affair, and she was afraid he would leave her. So we got a couple weeks where Debora changed, after Mike says he was thinking of leaving her.
Right, it was an effort.
She became the ideal wife. But it was too late. So finally Mike told her he was moving out and he wanted a divorce. Debora immediately stomped down to the basement where Tim was watching TV. She shouted at the top of her lungs and began to throw things around the room. Lamps and knickknacks shattered.
Yeah, this is outrageous. And of course, we're hearing this from Mike's side.
We are.
So we should take it with a grain of salt, but I don't think he's making it all up. It's pretty outrageous behavior. She shouted at Tim, "God damn, now look what he's going to do. He's going to cheat us out of what's ours." So I guess she's worried about the money there.
Right.
And Mike tried to draw her away from Tim and keep him out of it, but she persisted to involve him. She told him that his father was cheating on her, and she said that she was going to have to go back to work, and now she doesn't know where they're going to live. She doesn't know who will take care of the kids. So she's upsetting her child over this. It's rotten behavior.
Yeah, and Tim's trying to console his mom. He wouldn't talk to Mike. But this confirmed to Mike that he was doing the right thing. The marriage was destroying the children. So he moved out of the house and into an apartment, took the children 2 or 3 times a week, and things seemed to be getting a little better.
But the children were angry with him. But still he thought, well, that'll pass with time. Now that I'm out of the house, things will get better. Because he and Debora were getting along better without him being there. And Mike started to feel like they might be able to reconcile. So if the yelling and screaming could stop, he thought that he would like to have an intact family, even if he wasn't super happy.
Right. So they start talking about getting back together. Debora's getting calmer. He became more hopeful that things might be able to work. Mike told Debora that if they did work it out, he'd want to move to a newer house that didn't need as much upkeep.
Yeah, I guess there were a lot of projects around that house. The house was kind of falling apart, although it was still a lovely home. But Debora really liked this idea of getting a new house, so she agreed to that, and she went right out. He said if they had more room and they had a cleaner house that they'd be happier, and maybe their marriage would improve. So she went out looking at new homes, and she found this really gorgeous mansion on Canterbury Court. And Mike caught on to her enthusiasm when he looked at the house with her. He agreed it was perfect. It was a 5,000 square foot house. It had every amenity you could think of. And it was on the market for $600,000. But it had been vacant for a while, so the owner was willing to sell it to them for $400,000. So that was quite a bargain.
Huge bargain. Holy cow.
I mean, even for the $600,000, this was quite a home.
Yeah.
But I guess in the area they lived, housing wasn't that expensive.
No, in the Midwest. So Mike thinks about it, and then he starts to reconsider. He realized he'd been caught up in Debora's promises that things would be different, but he soon realized that nothing had really changed. They were only better because they weren't living together. So signing on to buy a second house when they hadn't even sold the first house seemed to be risky. He backed out. Debora, the kids, the real estate agent, they were all disappointed. The realtor couldn't understand why he had backed out. Mike told him there were personal issues that he wasn't going to discuss.
Yeah, so a few days later, Mike was working at the North Kansas Hospital on a Sunday when he got a call from the answering service. And he called the service back, and they said he needed to call his neighbor. There was a fire at his house. So the neighbor on the phone was panicking. She said that the house was on fire, but she was pretty sure that Debora and the kids weren't inside. So Mike raced home to 7 fire trucks and an ambulance outside his house. He's freaking out. There was a huge crowd and smoke was pouring out of the house. So he called Debora's cell phone and asked, "Where are the kids?" Well, Tim was playing soccer, and she and the girls were in the car with their dog Boomer. So Mike told Debora about the fire, and she came home. She told Mike over and over that she was happy she'd listened to Tim and brought Boomer the dog along with them. Otherwise, he would have died in the fire. So there was massive damage to the house. The fire had started in the basement and gone up the laundry chute. Most of the basement was ash, as was the kitchen. The damage estimate was $80,000, and that was about half of what they'd paid for this house. But Mike was so traumatized by those moments when he didn't know where his family was that he was vulnerable.
He was. Now, the insurance company sent an arson investigator, and he determined that the fire was caused by an unusual electrical problem. Turns out that the cord of a dehumidifier had been wrapped around a copper pipe so tightly that it had shorted through. Pipe had gotten hot, that it heated adjacent wood paneling, and that began to burn.
Yeah, a friend of Mike's heard the story, and he told him that Debora had set the fire to get him to come back. Mike didn't believe that, though. He thought that was crazy. But it is suspicious. The only thing is, how could she fool the arson expert? I don't know.
The explanation of how it happened just doesn't ring true. And it seems to me, as a layperson, admittedly, that would indicate arson. I mean, how do you get this wire wrapped so tightly around the pipe?
I don't know, but just the timing of it to me is very suspicious.
Well, yeah. So they had to have the house boarded up, and Mike moved Debora and the kids into his apartment. Mike and Debora reconciled. They put the bid back on the house on Canterbury Court.
So that's awfully convenient for what Debora wants, if you think about it.
Right. Isn't it?
Yeah, and they actually made money on the deal because the insurance company paid off the burned house and gave them money to get all new stuff, all new furniture. And so they had the house repaired and had everything fixed, and they made $20,000 profit. So they made money off this. The family went and took a trip to Disney World, and they came back to live at the 7517 Canterbury Court house in June 1994. So there was this initial period of optimism when they moved in. Debora furnished the rooms enthusiastically, and she really seemed to be trying to change. She cooked, she cleaned the house, tried to be, Miss Perfect Wife. Mike tried to work shorter hours to be home with them more. He committed himself to making the marriage work, and he promised his children that he'd never leave again, which is kind of a mistake to make promises like that.
Those are tough promises to keep.
And this honeymoon phase in the house lasted only 6 months.
Yeah, after Christmas, the same old problems resurfaced.
Well, yeah, they hadn't been solved.
No, not in the least. So the relationship between Mike and Debora hadn't improved. They had just distracted themselves with the fire and the beautiful new house. Mike realized that he didn't love Debora.
Yeah, and soon the house was as messy as the old house.
Yep. Debora lost interest in keeping it in order, which was very important to Mike. Absolutely no intimacy or passion between them. Mike had to admit that he wasn't attracted to his wife. Mike could barely remember her as the slender medical resident in the expensive sports car. And she'd been keeping control of herself with fewer angry outbursts, but Mike feared she would soon explode at the slightest irritation.
So Debora, Mike, and Tim were planning on going to this school trip to Peru with a group of other kids from Tim's school that summer. And Mike decided not to tell Debora he wanted a divorce until after the trip, because he knew if he said anything before the trip, she would make the trip unbearable. So if the trip went well, at least Tim would have this memory of a happy trip with his parents. So he decided, I've been in this for 12 years, I'll hang in for another 6 months, and hopefully I can get my divorce afterwards and we can work things out in a reasonable way. So let's take a second here to talk about our sponsor.
So our beer today, Old Bacchus Barley Wine, goes great with the dish I made recently with Spice Island's curry powder. For noticeably richer flavors, opt for premium spices from Spice Islands. Spice Islands uses a craft approach to deliver the most authentic and intense flavor possible. They also take extra steps to ensure richer flavors and, better yet, they maintain a strict standard for each item to ensure consistency, quality, and flavor. Whether you're looking for flavor adventure like a nice porter with a smoked paprika goulash or simply better tasting spaghetti sauce, fill your pantry with Spice Islands and taste the difference. Visit spiceislands.com/brewery for more spice facts and delicious recipes, including one for spiced maple carrots, a quick, simple side to complement any meal.
Sounds really good.
Doesn't it? That's spiceislands.com/brewery. Pick up Spice Island spices in the premium section of your local retailer.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about Margaret Hacker. She was married to Dr. John Hacker for 16 years when she met Mike and Debora during their trip to Peru. She had 2 sons, and one was the same age as Tim. So
right. And you remember Dr. Hacker?
Yes.
From medical school.
Right, her husband. She was in her early 40s in 1995, but she looked younger than that. She had blonde highlighted hair, green eyes, and an athletic figure, so she was an attractive woman. She hadn't worked for 10 years, but she was a nurse, and her husband John was an anesthesiologist. He was handsome and kind, but he did suffer from depression. Now, they lived in a very nice home that Margaret had decorated, and she kept it very tidy and homey. Margaret was a bubbly person, eternally optimistic. But years of being married to John had been difficult. She was just finally accepting that he was not a happy man. He was kind and a good person, but happiness just seemed beyond his reach. Margaret spent most of her time with female friends and her sons. She was active with the Pembroke Hill School, where both of her children and Deborah's children attended. And yes, her husband was the same John Hacker who'd been in Debora Greene's anatomy class back at the University of Kansas Medical School. Deborah and John had been pretty good friends back then. Margaret had met John in a surgical recovery room, and she was impressed with him right away. He was very smart, but she couldn't see the sadness that was such a big part of him back then. So the Hacker marriage, much like the Greene-Farrar marriage, showed fatal flaws right away. They started out in love, but soon it was obvious that they had different expectations. Over the years, he had become more and more depressed. They discussed divorce, but John wanted to wait until their boys were in college to break up. So in December 1994, John brought a gun to Margaret and asked her to hide it. He didn't trust himself not to kill himself. She wasn't aware, but he'd been gradually increasing the amount of his life insurance policies, too. When he was home, he was distant and emotionally removed from his wife. He watched TV, he napped, he didn't have any energy to fix things around the house, and she did all the gardening on her own. So it wasn't unusual for John to go to bed right after dinner and sleep through to the next morning.
Right, so Margaret saw this 1995 Pembroke Hill School Peru trip as a chance for her to step back and reevaluate her marriage. It would be a wonderful mother-son activity. John wasn't interested in going with it. So as the group of students and parents prepared to take the 2-week trip, they had meetings about what to take, what clothing to wear, what sights they would see, what health hazards they might experience. Now, Margaret's husband was a physician, and her husband John knew Deborah from medical school. Margaret had never met either Mike or Deborah. Mike practiced on the Missouri side of the river, and John's practice was on the Kansas side. Margaret's first impression of Mike was that he was an energetic, enthusiastic person, and she admits that she was drawn to him. Now, Mike and another physician were in charge of gathering health information and antibiotics for the trip. He carefully researched what viruses and bacteria might attack them in Peru. So Margaret didn't see Mike for 6 weeks before the Peru trip. She had talked with Deborah on the phone, but didn't meet her until after they left on their trip.
Yeah, so on Mother's Day before the trip, Mike, Deborah, and the kids went to dinner with Deborah's mother, Joanne. Joanne was not fond of Mike. Really strangely, she called him by his last name, Farrar.
Yeah.
Mike and Tim argued at dinner, and their argument escalated when they returned home from dinner. Tim called Mike a motherfucker as the fight became physical, and he punched Mike and broke his nose. So that just cracks me up. I mean, calling him a motherfucker, that reminds me of when our grandson, Jonah, we're in the van with the 2 little boys, and he says, motherfucker.
Yeah.
Well, we pulled over right away.
We did.
That didn't go over well.
No.
But, it didn't take much to straighten him out. All it took was a stern look, and he started crying. He knew he'd done wrong. But this was different. This was a teenager. So this is a father and his teenage son fighting. I'm sure that was pretty explosive.
Wouldn't you think?
Yeah. So the next morning, Mike went to a fellow physician to have his nose set, and he was embarrassed to tell him that his own son had broken his nose in a fight. Now, Tim was, by all accounts, an angry teenager. He was being manipulated by his mother, and he'd been encouraged to hate his father. But despite all this family tension, the 3 still planned to go on the trip to Peru. Now, Kate and Kelly would stay with a relative nearby, while the other 3 were away. Now,
Right.
Margaret Hacker and her son Brett spent a lot of time with one of the female teachers in Peru. Margaret would say she couldn't help but feel a little envious of Deborah for being on the trip with her husband and her son. Mike and Deborah seemed like the perfect married couple in Peru, sharing responsibilities, joking, and laughing. She was at first surprised by Deborah's looks, though. She expected her to be prettier and more fit. She thought that Mike and Deborah might have made a good match because of their differences, though. Deborah was larger than Mike, and she had short, masculine hair. And since working from home, Deborah had become less attractive. At home, she often wore a muumuu or a sweatsuit all day. On the trip, she wore old T-shirts and shorts. But her clothes made sense for the activities they were involved in. So Margaret kind of felt bad for being so judgmental. I mean, they are on an outdoorsy trip. What do you expect?
Right, exactly. So while in Peru, Mike grew a beard. He wore a wide-brimmed Indiana Jones-type hat, and Margaret thought he was a pretty attractive guy.
Yeah, she'd liked him from the beginning. She admitted that.
Right. And she couldn't help but compare his take-charge attitude with the passivity of her depressed husband. Deborah may have picked up on this because she began to go out of her way to ignore Margaret while on the trip.
Yeah, but Deborah was really well-liked and a lot of fun on the trip. She had a great sense of humor, and she made everyone laugh. Most of the adults on the trip had severe diarrhea, though, in the first few days. After taking Cipro they had brought with them, they recovered within 36 hours, and that was the only illness on the trip. Now, being two of the most physically fit parents on the trip, Margaret and Mike did end up spending a fair amount of time together on hikes and things. And they may have denied it at the time, but looking back, they were definitely attracted to each other. And Deborah probably saw that.
I'm sure she did.
Yeah.
So once they get home from the trip, this facade of togetherness between Mike and Deborah faded very quickly. 2 days after returning home, Mike brought some photos from the trip to Margaret's house, and that's when they began the affair. They both had busy lives and spouses, so they only got together a couple times a week. And sometimes they just met in their cars, talking and holding hands. Everyone who had gone to Peru that summer got back together once home for barbecues and 4th of July fireworks. Margaret thought that nobody, including Deborah, knew about the affair. Mike had decided that he was going to get a divorce, but he was afraid of Deborah's reaction when he told her.
Yeah, so it wasn't until late July when he asked Deborah for a divorce again, and she refused to break the news to the children together. And she told the 3 kids that their father had broken his promise to them and was leaving them after all. So Deborah played the victim, and Mike's children hated him. This is such a manipulative thing to do to your own children, right? She's not really considering their feelings at all.
No, they're pawns.
Now, one of the most outrageous reasons that Deborah gave for staying together was that the girls would not be Botars. So that is short for Belles of the American Royal, which is like a coming out event for teen girls.
Yeah, like debutante stuff.
So there were several social activities during the American Royal where about 20 young women are presented each year. And these were considered the loveliest, most talented daughters of Kansas City. And Deborah, of course, wanted her girls to join, and she wanted Tim to be a Botar escort. So this seems like a really stupid reason to want to stay together, but I guess it was a big deal to her.
It's a big deal to her.
Yeah.
So even though they're going to get a divorce, the children wanted Mike to stay. So Deborah moved to a guest bedroom, and then she began to drink heavily. I think this guest bedroom was down in the basement, right? Kind of apart from the rest of the house?
Yeah, on the first floor, I think.
Okay. So she got up in the morning, she drove the children to their lessons in school, but by evening she was in the bedroom with a bottle of liquor until she passed out. Then it got worse, and there were days when she couldn't even get out of bed. So Tim and Kate took over as the parental figures and became very protective of their mother.
Mike was called home from work one day that fall when Kate couldn't wake her mother. He found Deborah on her bed with an empty bottle of gin beside her. Mike took the children to his sister's house and went back to take care of Deborah, but when he returned to the house he couldn't find Deborah. It was very strange because she'd just been passed out drunk. Or maybe she was faking it, he wasn't sure. He searched the entire house and couldn't find her. The car was still there. And just as he was getting ready to call the police, the phone rang, and it was Deborah, and she said she was at a friend's house. Now, Mike had no idea where she could be because she really didn't have any friends, and she didn't take the car with her. She'd quit tennis, she didn't have a job. She didn't even sound drunk anymore when she called. She called him repeatedly that night until he finally unplugged the phone and went to sleep. But later on, he would figure out that Deborah had been hiding under the bed in the guest room in the house the whole time.
Now, how weird is that?
That's really freaky.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So she was in the house the whole time.
The whole time. She's calling from the children's phone line.
And she was probably up wandering around after he went to sleep.
Yeah.
It's freaky.
Ooh.
Yeah. On August 11th, Mike came home from work after the family had eaten, and Deborah had saved a chicken salad sandwich for him in the refrigerator. So he stood in the kitchen and talked to her as he ate it, and he said the sandwich tasted slightly off, and he told Deborah it was a little bitter. But Deborah said that their sandwiches hadn't been bitter, and it wasn't so noticeable that he stopped eating it. He was hungry, and he polished off the sandwich and didn't think much about it.
Yeah, but then that night he started feeling sick. He was nauseated and then began to vomit and had abdominal pain followed by severe diarrhea. He was on call that weekend, and he went to work the next morning. The illness lasted 3 to 4 days, but he was able to work through it.
He was feeling better by Wednesday, but then on Thursday his symptoms were much worse. He was shaking and vomiting Friday morning, and he couldn't make it to work. So he called his personal physician, who admitted him to the hospital. He was so dehydrated.
He was in the hospital for a week. He had fevers up to 104 degrees. And he was severely dehydrated. His blood pressure systolic was 65 to 70, where it should be 120 to 140. And his diastolic blood pressure was not even detectable.
That's scary.
Very. So he gets moved to the intensive care unit, and they put a big central line IV in. So this central line is just an IV that's put into a bigger vessel, so you can infuse larger amounts of fluid.
But that's a procedure.
Yeah.
It's not like just putting an IV in, because you're going right up by the chest, right?
Well, there's different areas, but yeah.
Yeah.
So that was...
That's a big deal.
That's a big deal. His blood was cultured, and it was positive for a bacteria called Streptococcus viridans. He had a sigmoidoscopy, a colonoscopy, and an upper GI endoscopy. His doctors believed a break in the lining of his colon from the severe diarrhea had let the strep bacteria into his system. But they didn't know what had caused the diarrhea in the first place.
So this is kind of a mystery.
It's a mystery. So he's in the hospital for, a week?
Until August 25th.
August 25th. He finally felt well enough, after going home, felt well enough to eat a dinner. Deb had made him a spaghetti dinner. Then within 3 or 4 hours, he was violently sick again, and he was readmitted to the hospital that same night.
So he didn't last long at home.
No. So the strep infection had resolved. Blood cultures were negative. The infectious disease specialist settled on 2 possibilities from his trip to Peru: typhoid fever or tropical sprue. But his symptoms didn't really fit with either. So typhoid fever is caused by a bacteria that you get from drinking bad water and stuff. Mm-hmm. Tropical sprue is less well understood. It's thought to be caused by a bacteria, but they don't really know. But the result of having tropical sprue is you have a malabsorption syndrome where you can't absorb the nutrients in your gut.
And how do they treat that? Just treat the symptoms, or?
Right.
Yeah.
And if they do find a bacteria, they treat the bacteria.
Okay.
Now, symptoms didn't really fit either of these diagnoses. And Peru was not a big spot to have tropical sprue. There's not a lot of cases from Peru. So they thought these were possibilities, but they didn't like either of the possible diagnoses.
Well, they just don't really know what to attribute it to.
No.
So they try to attribute it to Peru, but the fact is he'd been well for a month after coming home. So that would be odd, wouldn't it? To be well for a month and all of a sudden get sick?
It would be.
Yeah.
It would suggest that the Peru trip wasn't responsible for the illness.
Well, he was put on a 3-week course of antibiotics that would take care of typhoid if he had it. Meanwhile, Deborah's mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer. So Deborah had told her mother that Mike was sick, but she didn't explain how serious it was. Anyway, Joanne said that Mike was a terrible boob when he was ill, and he was probably just putting on a show, so she's a nice mother-in-law. By the end of August, Mike had lost 30 pounds. Deborah told him he needed to be in his own home with his family, and she would take care of him. He was too weak to care for himself, but he was released on August 30th in Deborah's care. And he said that she was kind to him then and took care of him at home.
Well, he's home. He's resting. Labor Day, Mike had been home for nearly a week, and he's getting better all the time. He was downstairs watching the Kansas City Chiefs game. Deborah brought him a plate with ham, beans, and cornbread, and then that evening his illness returned with a vengeance. Horrible burning pain in his stomach, followed by vomiting and diarrhea. He gets readmitted to the hospital.
Yeah, so while he's still in the hospital on September 9th, he got a call from his daughter, Kate. Now, Kate was upset and crying because Deborah was drinking heavily, and she and Tim were frightened for her. Mike got on the phone with Tim and told him to hide all of the alcohol in the house. And Tim's distressed because he can hide all the alcohol, but there's a big wine collection in the basement. What can he do about that?
Can't do anything.
So Mike thought about calling his parents, but both of his mother's parents were terminally ill, and his parents were dealing with that. So he counted on Tim to look after things at home, which really wasn't fair to that kid.
Not in the least.
This kid's in a horrible situation.
Yeah. I want you to hide all the liquor.
And that's just not fair to put that on him.
No.
Now I can kind of understand Mike's sick, he's in the hospital. He probably felt kind of desperate, but he really needed to get another adult involved there. Now Margaret was very concerned about Mike, and she visited him in the hospital, even though Debora by this time knew about their affair. Now Margaret was in love with Mike, and she decided to ask John for a divorce, so it's getting a little soap opera-ish here. She'd convinced herself that John might be happier without her, because she wasn't able to help him. He was still very depressed. So John said okay, he rented a house, and he began to move into the rented house on Labor Day. He moved his things by himself in his truck with several trips to the rental house, which was only minutes away from the family home. He was crying all that day, Margaret said, and she told him he didn't have to move out so quickly, he could take his time. And he'd planned a fishing trip with friends the following week, so she was hopeful that that would cheer him up when he got to go with his friends on a little trip. So John spent that night in the house with Margaret and the children, and then on the morning of September 5th, when they woke up, John was gone. Now Margaret assumed he'd left for work. She went about her day, expecting that he would be back to the house for dinner. By 6:30 p.m., when John hadn't called or shown up, she began to worry. When she went to the rental house looking for John, she found him in his car in the garage. He'd actually killed himself. He had an IV in his left arm, which was attached to 2 syringes, and there was also a vial of medicine on the car seat. Margaret tried CPR as her friend, who'd gone over there with her, called 911, but it became clear that John had been dead for hours, probably since early that day.
Right. She wasn't going to resuscitate him.
No.
So Mike was in the hospital when John died, and Mike kept telling Margaret that it wasn't her fault, but she obviously felt very guilty. When Mike told Debora what had happened, she became hysterical and drank more. She called Mike's sister Karen and told her Margaret killed John.
Yeah, so...
What a sweet thing to say.
She's kind of a bitch, like I said.
A day or two before John killed himself, one of Margaret's relatives said that she overheard John talking on the phone with Debora.
So this, I think, is really interesting.
There's some interesting thoughts here.
I mean, if Debora had told him about the affair his wife was having with her husband, it may have definitely worsened his depression. He was very emotionally fragile. And I think Debora could be pretty cruel.
Well, we've seen that.
So I wonder if she kind of pushed him in that direction. What do you think?
I think that's a very plausible thing.
Yeah? I mean, if she was talking to him just days before?
I mean, maybe she didn't intentionally think he was going to kill himself.
Maybe not.
But she definitely wanted him to know that his wife was having an affair.
Well, yeah, she may have been just trying to commiserate with him, like our partners are cheating on us.
Yeah.
And he was just such a sad man that was his reaction to it. That wouldn't surprise me. So afterwards, there were rumors that Margaret had either killed John or had driven him to suicide, and Margaret was not liked in the community. She's attractive, her husband's just killed himself, she's having an affair, so she's kind of like the Jezebel of the community.
Not a good thing.
No. Didn't help that she got millions of dollars of insurance after his death. Remember, he'd been adding to his insurance.
Right.
But police questioned her, and she was pretty easily cleared of any wrongdoing. But it did take 2 autopsies to identify John's cause of death.
Yeah, one of the syringes on the scene was labeled pentothal, and an empty bottle of Pavuline was also found in the car. So pentothal is a barbiturate that's sometimes used as an anesthesia agent to induce sleep. Pavuline is a muscle relaxant paralytic agent.
So that's kind of like succinylcholine?
Right.
Okay.
So you give it in conjunction with the pentothal, or you can.
And it would cause you to stop breathing and go to sleep.
Yeah. And if you're just inducing anesthesia, you got the muscles relaxed, so it's easier to intubate the patient.
Yeah, you're going to breathe for them.
Right.
But the weird thing was there were no detectable drugs or alcohol in his blood. So does that drug leave the system quickly, or what's up with that?
No, but you can also look at the sequence in which the drugs were administered. If he did the pentothal, that should still be in his blood. But if he did the Pavuline and did a quick hit, you might not discover that, and it'll stop you pretty cold.
Well, they were kind of confused by the order of these drugs, I guess. I'm not totally clear on it because...
Yeah, well, the repeat autopsy, the specialist looked at it and came up with a theory on how it could have been done without showing any trace in the blood.
Right. Well, and he's an anesthesiologist, so
Yeah.
if anyone knows how to kill themselves in the best way possible, I mean, in the most peaceful way, I guess, he would know. And he had the IV in, so it's pretty clear that he did that.
Right.
Right.
He did. So Mike got released from the hospital on September 11th. He had an intravenous feeding set up and was on a gluten-free diet, and that's part of the tropical sprue treatment.
Oh, okay.
So gluten-containing foods can irritate. It's sort of like having celiac disease.
And that's what they were kind of thinking happened with the spaghetti and some of the food he ate at home.
Possibly.
Maybe that's why he couldn't tolerate it.
He couldn't eat anything with grains.
No.
And he had an IV line for his feedings. And he had put it together that he got sick every time he went home. But he wasn't sure why.
Yeah, he even wondered if maybe it was stress with the relationship.
Yeah. Now, Margaret told him that she was afraid Deborah had been poisoning him. But Mike couldn't imagine her doing that.
So that's the second or third person that's told him,
Yeah.
right? Well, plus he was told that Deborah did the fire. He couldn't believe that either.
Right.
So something's up with Deborah. Although she did take care of Mike. But he made it clear to her at the same time that he was going to move forward with the divorce when he was back on his feet, so she probably didn't like that. She continued to drink each night until she passed out, and then she began to threaten to kill herself. So this was concerning, this mother of three being that unstable. So out of concern, Mike decided to search the house, and he admits that he went through Deborah's purse in the guest bedroom when she was passed out on the bed. He looked through it, probably looking for drugs or something. And what he found was pretty puzzling. There were 10 seed packets that were all the same. They were labeled castor beans, Rhinoceros communis. They were the seeds of the castor oil plant. And Deborah had never done any gardening.
No, so that's suspicious.
Yeah, so in the bed there was also a letter.
It was in Deborah's handwriting. It was a letter he had read before, but at that time it had been typed and was in his mailbox. In it, the letter stated that it was from somebody anonymously telling Mike that he shouldn't divorce Deborah. It said that she was a wonderful mother and that the children would be deprived of social standing in the future if their parents were divorced. They would never be Botars.
This is such a childish thing.
Yeah.
Just shows me that she's emotionally stunted. This is something a kid would do. I mean, the handwritten letter in Deborah's purse seemed to be a rough draft of a printed letter that he's seen before. And then he noticed a warning on the seed packets: castor beans are extremely toxic and are not to be taken internally. He couldn't imagine that she was going to plant these seeds, so he worried that maybe she was planning to kill herself with the poison. Now, she also had 3 empty vials of potassium chloride and 3 used syringes in her purse. And at the bottom he found a crumpled receipt for the seed packets from a garden center 20 minutes south of their home. So he took the seed packets and the vials in a plastic bag and hid them in the closet. So can you tell us just a little bit about potassium chloride? What's the significance of her having that in her purse?
Well, we all need potassium in our blood, but too much of it can be dangerous. So if you conceivably could use it as a suicide method, if you inject a big bolus of potassium chloride in a vein, it'll stop the heart.
Well, they were empty vials, so Mike had wondered if she had put it in his IV feedings and it just wasn't enough to do anything.
Yeah.
But it might have been an attempt to hurt him.
It could have been, although she, as a physician, should have known that it wasn't going to kill him.
Maybe, but she's really not going on all 4 cylinders at this point.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway, he'd hid everything in a plastic bag, and he began to feel better, and his IV was removed, and he was able to eat. He gained a little bit of the weight back. Now, then he decided to ask Deborah about these seed packets, and she said she was going to plant them, and he didn't believe that. And when he pushed her on the subject, she told him that she had planned to kill herself. Now, Deborah's drinking and strange behavior became worse, and Mike finally called the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, which was about an hour away, to see about having her committed for some psychiatric treatment. Now, not surprisingly, she refused to go. So Mike then called the police and told them he was afraid his wife was a danger to herself and others, And when the police came over, Mike was out in the entryway, and the 3 children were kind of huddled together. Kelly, the youngest, was crying uncontrollably, while Tim and Kate were trying to console her. So the police came in, they found Debora on her bed in a t-shirt and panties, and there was a strong smell of alcohol, they said. They had to raise their voices to wake her, and they told her why they were there. Now Debora jumped up furious and began calling Mike names. So she liked to call him asshole and fuckhole, which that's a new one for me.
Yeah.
She was polite.
That's inventive.
Yeah. She was polite to the officers, though, but anytime she saw Mike, she just screamed like a banshee. So Mike did show the police the plastic bag with the seeds and the potassium chloride vials, saying he was afraid that she was suicidal. So police took her to the ER for an evaluation, and the ER doctor knew Debora from years ago and was pretty shocked to see her appearance. She was extremely disheveled and smelled like alcohol, and Debora seemed embarrassed at first. But when Mike arrived, she jumped up cursing and she spit at him, and she said, "You're going to get these kids over our dead bodies." Now the ER doctor wasn't sure if she should believe the husband or Debbie, because you don't want to commit a mother based on what her husband, who's going to divorce her, says.
Right.
So I don't know about this decision, but she called Tim, and I feel like Tim's getting way too involved in things. He's a kid.
He's just a little kid.
Well, little kid. He's a young teen.
Okay, but he's a kid.
Yeah.
But anyway, she calls to get a third opinion.
Well, she thought maybe she'd get a more objective opinion, so I can kind of see that. There was no, friends or anyone else to call. But Tim agreed with his father, and he said that they were afraid she would hurt herself. So Mike showed that doctor the castor seed packets and told him about his theory that she may have been suicidal. But the ER doc didn't see ricin poisoning as a likely method of suicide because she's a doctor. She would hopefully have better ways of doing that than being miserably sick and having diarrhea and vomiting.
It'd be a tough suicide.
It'd be awful.
So the doctor returned to the area where she had left Debora, and Debora's gone. Hospital gets searched. She's not there. They put out a call for the police to look for Debora. They eventually found her miles away from the hospital, walking towards her home.
Yeah, in a Johnny.
So she's returned to the ER, and a psychiatric consult gets done. And at this time, she voluntarily committed herself to Menninger's clinic. Clinic looked more like a retreat for the rich and famous than a hospital set away from the road with posh landscaping.
Yeah, so now Debora's in treatment, and Mike and the children have a little bit of relief from the constant fighting. Mike was still out of work from his illness, so he got to spend some time with the kids. He planned to move out after Debora was better, and she'd returned home. Now at Menninger's, Debora was diagnosed with major bipolar depression, and she was started on Prozac, Transine, and Klonopin, and after just 4 days she signed herself out. So Mike had researched the castor seeds, and he learned that they were to be planted in the early spring. So he thought, why did Debora have these seeds in September? He also learned that it was the core of the bean that was poisonous. The symptoms of ricin poisoning were eerily similar to his own symptoms, and ricin was one of the deadliest poisons. It was fatal in most cases, despite medical treatment. So there was no antidote either. Treatment for it was only aimed at relieving these symptoms. So he took a journal article on the poison to his doctors, who agreed that he may have been poisoned. There were tests that could determine if his body had formed antibodies to the ricin in his bloodstream. He wondered if Debora had meant to kill him, or if she had wanted to keep him sick so he couldn't leave. So as far as he knew, he hadn't been poisoned since his latest hospital release, and she easily could have put some in his PICC line if she wanted to. So whatever her motive, he felt certain that he had been poisoned by Debora. She was home after 4 days in the hospital. She seemed better, and he moved out. He didn't tell her what he knew about the ricin. He decided to wait for the antibody tests. So can you tell me just a little bit, what are the antibodies, just for people who don't know?
Antibodies are chemicals or proteins that fight infections and stuff.
Right, so how would they know about the ricin from looking at antibodies?
So ricin is a protein, and you can look for antibodies to ricin in the blood.
Okay, so if you get sick from ricin, your body would create special antibodies just to fight that certain thing. Ricin. That's how you'd know.
So you can do a simple blood test. Now, Mike found an apartment just 10 minutes away from the house. He's concerned about his children's psychological well-being, but he wasn't worried about Debora hurting them. She had always been an attentive mother, and he felt like his being out of the house could only make it a more peaceful environment. Debora hired divorce attorney Ellen Ryan, who was the same attorney who had been representing John Hacker in his divorce. On the first appointment, Ellen was surprised to see Dr. Greene in a dirty sweatshirt with uncombed hair and no makeup. She told Ellen that her husband wanted a divorce. She also said that she had been referred to Ellen by her friend John Hacker, who she had spent a lot of time with over the summer.
Yeah, so that makes me wonder. So that makes me feel like she was commiserating with him.
If it's true that she actually spent time with him.
Well, I mean, she knew that Ellen was going to handle his divorce for him. How'd she know that?
She told Ellen about the affair between Margaret and Mike. She also claimed that John was not suicidal, implying that Mike and Margaret had killed him.
That's something to imply.
It is, isn't it?
It's a big thing.
That's a biggie.
Well, Ellen felt sorry for Debora, who seemed financially clueless and vulnerable, so she did agree to represent her. Debora seemed less volatile after that. She was drinking and raging less. She went out and adopted a greyhound, and the kids returned to school. Now, Mike invited the children to his apartment on weekends, but they only came a few times. Tim and Kate were still very angry with him for leaving, and Mike made efforts to be at all of Tim's soccer matches to try and win him back. Now, Debora was civil with him in public, and sometimes he stopped by the house to see the kids, but he always refused any food or drink that was offered to him by Debora.
Smart move.
Yeah.
Now, Debora pretty much lived through her children. Sounds like her own family.
Yeah, right.
Her own mother.
Mm-hmm.
She was proud of everything they accomplished, and she bragged about their IQs and their good looks. And they seemed to be the only friends she had. Yeah, she pretty much isolated herself from everything.
Seems like it, yeah.
They were also her excuse for giving up her medical practice. So she was very thrilled when Kate got the lead in an upcoming Christmas ballet, and she vowed that the girls would be Botars despite the divorce.
Yeah, but then in October she began to deteriorate again. She was drinking very heavily, and her anger was bubbling over more often. She refused to admit that her marriage was in trouble before the Peru trip, and she blamed the divorce entirely on Margaret and the affair. Now she told the children, which is very inappropriate, Margaret leads your father around by his penis.
Yeah.
Now, I think she made several remarks like that to her kids. Debora called Mike with different stories depending on the day. One was that she was going to a distant country to be a missionary, and he would have to take the children. Another was that she was starting a psychiatric residency at Meninger's clinic. Now, parents of Pembroke Hill students were becoming worried about the situation in Debora's home. She often had slurred speech and the smell of alcohol on her breath. One neighbor reported seeing Kelly locked out of the house late at night and the other two kids fighting outside at around 11 p.m. Mike picked up Tim and Kelly at 6:40 p.m. on October 23rd to go to Tim's hockey game. Now, that night, Debora had an appointment with her psychiatrist, and Kate had a ballet practice that Debora was going to take her to. The hockey game was over around 8:30. Tim had played a really great game, and the three of them were in a good mood as he drove them home. It was about 8:45 when they arrived at the house on Canterbury Court. Mike decided to walk the children inside. Kate and Debora were in the kitchen. Kate was doing homework, and Debora was taking some Kentucky Fried Chicken out of the oven that she'd reheated. Now, Mike stayed for about 5 or 10 minutes, he said, and Debora was okay. She just ignored him. Now, Tim ran upstairs to shower, and Mike took his mail from a pile on the counter and said good night. A little after 9, Mike ate dinner at Margaret's house with her two kids. After dinner, they watched Monday Night Football. He was paged at 10:45 p.m., and it was the house number at Canterbury Court. Mike called the number back, and Debora answered. She said maybe one of the children had paged him, but then she added, "They're all asleep. Do you want me to wake them?" That's odd.
Very odd.
Mike said no and hung up, and then 5 minutes later he was paged again. This time Debora told him that her attorney had approved his use of the attorney who had handled their finances. So that was something he'd been waiting to hear about. He was happy to hear that. Then he hung up again. And then she'd called again and asked what he was doing, and he told her he was having dinner with friends. At 11:15, Mike drove to his apartment from Margaret's house, and it was only like a 10-minute drive. He was almost home when Debora paged him again. After he got home, he called her back from his apartment, and this was around 11:40 p.m., and he said she sounded intoxicated this time. He was getting really angry that she was drinking and repeatedly paging him. He lost his temper and he started yelling at her. He told her that she needed to buckle down and take care of the kids. He told her there were parents at the school who had noticed her behavior and her poor parenting, and they were considering calling social services. He told her to get her act in gear and get all of this taken care of. And then he went on. He told her that she was crazy, and he told her that he knew she had poisoned him. He said he was going to try to get custody of the kids from her. And she was furious, and they were yelling back and forth at each other, and finally he hung up on her. Now 5 minutes later she called him back, and he picked it up, and she seemed surprised to hear his voice. She said, "Oh, I didn't know you were home. I'm not going to say anything." And then she hung up.
Yeah, then at 12:30 the phone rang again, but it wasn't Debora. It was the next-door neighbor on Canterbury Court, Mary Foreman. Before he could say anything, Mary shouted, "Your house is on fire. There are 5 trucks here. Your wife is a fucking arsonist."
So, wow.
Interesting phone call.
So Mike rushed to his pickup truck and raced to the house.
Right. And he got there with the house engulfed in flames. So according to the video of the police interview with Debora after the fire, she said that the family had a normal day before the fire. Kids went to school, did their chores, before attending after-school activities. Kate went to her dance class, Tim to a hockey game. Mike had taken Tim and Kelly to the hockey game while Debora took Kate to ballet lessons. The family was together around 9 when Tim and Kelly were dropped back at the house for dinner.
Yeah, so she told police that she had 1 or 2 drinks after dinner and went to her bedroom, leaving it only to speak to Tim in the kitchen sometime between 10 and 11, shortly before he went to bed. Now Kelly and Kate had gone to bed earlier, each taking one of the family's 2 dogs with them. Debora said that she had fallen asleep around 11:30, and at some point before falling asleep she said she had spoken to Mike, who had phoned asking who had paged him. She told police that she and Mike were in the process of a divorce, though she did not know how far along in the process they were, and that although the children were very upset at the prospect, she herself was not, and she was looking forward to being able to rebuild her life without Mike. So she said she was awoken sometime after midnight by the sound of the home's built-in fire alarm system. At first she assumed the sound was a false alarm caused by their dogs triggering the burglar alarm, but when she tried to shut off the alarm at the control panel in her bedroom, it continued sounding, and she opened her bedroom door and saw smoke in the hallway. So she closed the door and exited the house using a deck that was connected to her first-floor bedroom. While standing on the deck, she heard her son Tim on the home's intercom system calling and asking her what he should do. And she quite curiously said, "He used to be my 13-year-old. So she said to police that she had told him to stay in the house and wait for the firefighters to rescue him. She had then knocked on a neighbor's door to ask them to call 911, although she actually said to them, "Call 111. When she returned to the house, she found Kate, who had climbed through her second-floor bedroom window on the roof of the home's garage, and this is when she called to Kate to jump, and Kate landed on the ground, but she was safe. Now, detectives noted during her interview that she didn't appear to be or to have been crying, and her manner was talkative, even cheerful at times. She repeatedly referred to Tim and Kelly in the past tense and referred to all of her children by their ages rather than their names. Her accounts of times from the previous evening varied, and she seemed uncertain what time she had done things like talk to Mike and what time she'd gone to bed.
Right. At 5:30 in the morning, a detective arrived from the fire scene to advise those at the police station that Tim and Kelly Farrar had been found dead in the home. Debora initially reacted with sadness, but that quickly changed to anger. She shouted at detectives claiming that firefighters had not done enough to save the children. Where before she had been cooperative and friendly with the detectives interviewing her, she now began to attack them verbally, calling the investigators pathetic, alleging that they had withheld from her knowledge of the children's deaths, and demanding to be allowed to see Mike and the remains of the family house. She stressed to police that she wanted to be the one to tell my husband our babies are dead.
So that's bizarre.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So they didn't grant this request. She got released from the police station in the early morning of October 24th after questioning. With the family home burned down, she had nowhere to stay. Mike refused to let her stay in his apartment, but he gave her some cash, and she rented a room in a local hotel. Ellen Ryan, her divorce lawyer, found that there found her there later in the day in a very distraught state. She repeatedly asked Ryan whether her children had died. She chanted rhythmically about their deaths and seemed unable to care for herself.
Yeah, so Debora was transported to a local hospital for treatment, but she remained emotionally unstable, suffering from insomnia and appearing to Ellen Ryan to be unable to take care of herself, even after she was released from the hospital. Now, police interviewed Mike at 6:20 a.m., informing him immediately that the bodies of his children, Tim and Kelly, had been recovered from the fire. He told police about the deterioration of his marriage and his health over the past 6 months. He said that the day of the fire, about a month after his last release from the hospital, he'd taken the day off work, the first day of what he intended to be a week-long vacation. He had spent the afternoon with Margaret Hacker and then picked up Tim and Kelly for Tim's hockey game. After dropping the children back off with their mother around 8:45, he had dinner with Margaret, and he left Margaret's house around 11:15 that evening. So throughout the evening of October 23rd, there were a series of phone calls with Debora that he said escalated into a confrontation. He was convinced that Debora was continuing to drink heavily while she should have been caring for the children, and he told her that he knew she had poisoned him and that social services might be called in to protect the children if she failed to get her life together. After the last call, Mike said he watched television alone in his apartment until about 12:30 when the neighbor called to tell him about the fire. So during his police interview after the fire, Mark's red eyes and trembling voice were noticed by the detectives. He told them that Debora had been very concerned about money in the divorce and that she may have set fire to the house to get insurance payout. But he said she'd never given any indication that she would harm their children.
So after his interview with the police, Mike immediately filed for divorce and filed for custody of Kate. She had been taken in by Mike's parents after the fire. A court later awarded temporary custody of Kate to Mike's parents due to Debora's instability and Kate's anger with her father.
So let's go over what Kate said to police.
Right, the one survivor.
Yeah, their surviving daughter told investigators that on that night she'd woken up to find the fire already burning. Seeing smoke seeping into her room, she opened the bedroom door and called to her brother. Then she closed the door and placed a hang-up 911 call that alerted police. Then she crawled out of her bedroom window to escape the fire. Kate reported to police that when she called to her mother after escaping onto the garage roof, her mom had seemed terribly upset and had called to Kate to jump into her arms. Though Debora missed catching her daughter when she jumped, Kate was not hurt. So when the two ran into Mike minutes later, Kate said that her father had been accusing her mom, and her mom had been crying and worried about the two other kids, Tim and Kelly. So she's kind of defending her mom here.
She is. And also according to Kate, Mike had moved out of the family home and had rejected Debora's desire for a friendly separation. Kate stressed that she loved and respected her mother and that all of the children had good relationships with her, but that she was upset and angry at her father for leaving the mother. Pressed some more, she acknowledged that her mother had begun to drink large quantities of alcohol. She denied she'd ever seen matches in the house and was surprised that Tim had not escaped by the same route she had, which was via a bedroom window onto the roof.
But his mother had told him to wait for help.
Right. So he's being a good son and listening to his mother.
I guess. That's just horrific. So the fire investigation. The Eastern Kansas Multi-Agency Task Force was called to conduct an arson investigation on the house. Staffed by fire investigators and search teams from throughout the area, they focused on determining the origin and cause of the fire, searching through debris for usable evidence and interviewing witnesses. Now, a dog trained to detect the scent of fire accelerants was brought in to assist. Investigators ruled out common causes of accidental fires, including electrical panels and furnaces. They determined that the basement level of the home, which contained the furnaces, had not been a point of origin, but there were two small fires unconnected to the main building that occurred in that area. So there were pour patterns on the ground, on the second floor and the first floor, indicating that a flammable liquid had been poured there, and it covered many areas on the ground floor. It also blocked off the stairway from the second floor to the ground floor, which would have prevented the kids from escaping. Now, also interesting was the pour patterns had stopped at the door of the house's master bedroom, but had soaked into the carpeting in the hallway leading to the children's bedrooms. Investigators couldn't determine the precise liquid used, though they proved that a can of gasoline in the family shed was not used. The amount of accelerant used was identified as being between 3 and 10 gallons, and concluding that the fire was a result of arson, the investigators on October 26th called in a second area task force, and this one was focused on it as a homicide investigation. On October 27th, the district attorney for Johnson County was informed that the investigation was now a criminal investigation.
So in seeking to find who had set the fire, investigators looked first for physical evidence of fire setting on the people who had been in the house. They suspected that because of the use of accelerant, the fire may have flashed over at the point of ignition and either singed or burned the arsonist. They tested clothing worn by both Mike and Debora that night and took samples of hair from both of them. Neither Debora's nor Mike's clothing showed evidence of having been in contact with accelerant. Mike's hair showed no singeing, but Debora's, which actually had been cut twice between the time of the fire and the time the police took the hair samples from her, showed significant singeing.
I just wonder why they didn't take samples right afterwards when they were interviewing her.
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
Detectives recalled that she had denied ever having been in close proximity to flames. She had reported leaving the house after seeing smoke and not coming into contact with the fire either on the deck, outside her bedroom, or in the process of getting Kate off the garage roof. The neighbors said that when she had come to their door to ask them to call for help, her hair had appeared to be wet. So that's interesting.
Very much, yeah, very much so. When police were told about the possibility of Michael having been poisoned in the months before the fire, detectives investigated the origin of the castor beans that had led to police investigating the September domestic dispute. So the label on the seed packets identified them as a product of the Earl May chain of stores, and an officer found contact information for the Olathe, Kansas Earl May store in Debora's address book. The detectives contacted nearby Earl May stores to find if any employees remembered selling the castor beans, which were out of season in the fall. So a clerk in Missouri recalled that in September a woman had ordered 10 packets of the out-of-season seeds and explained that she needed them for a school project. The clerk gave a description of the buyer that corresponded to Debora and identified her in a photo lineup, but only with 70% certainty at that point. Now, register tapes in the store's records showed that a purchase price corresponding to 10 packets of castor beans had been rung up on either September 20th or September 22nd. Now, no records were found in any Earl May store of earlier purchases that would have corresponded to Mike's first illness earlier in the year, though.
So Mike underwent brain surgery in November of 1995 to treat an aneurysm that his doctors believed had been caused by the poisoning.
Yeah, how did that work?
Well, an aneurysm is a weakening of a blood vessel. In this case, it was in his brain. So it gets weaker and it expands because it's weak, and the danger is that it can rupture, which, depending on the site of that, could be catastrophic. So the ricin is thought to have caused some weakening of the connective tissue of the blood vessel.
Wow, so it was more than just a GI thing then.
Oh, the ricin?
Yeah,
the poisoning?
the ricin damage was more than just that.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so he had surgery for that in November 1995.
Right. Then media reports in the first week of November of 1995 suggested that the investigation had narrowed the field of suspects, first to those intimately familiar with the house and later to one person. Based on the police investigation, news reports in the following days speculated that the apparent poisoning of Michael Farrar may have been linked to the case, but officials declined to name the person suspected in either the arson or the poisoning at that time.
Now, didn't he have trouble with his heart as well?
Yes, he did.
And what caused that?
Well, he had endocarditis, and I think we'll talk about a side effect of the endocarditis. He ended up with a brain abscess.
And that's in addition to the aneurysm.
That's in addition to. Yeah, he had more than one craniotomies, brain surgeries.
Wow, that's a lot that went on with that.
Yeah. So endocarditis is an infection of the inner lining of the heart. Usually it's one of the valves of the heart.
Yeah, I think with him it was a valve.
It was. It was his mitral valve. So what happens is that when you have bacteria in your blood, which he did, he had Streptococcus viridans, so he was septic with that, and the bacteria start growing on a place, in his case his mitral valve. And it grows, and it grows into some actual growth on the valve. And what can happen is pieces of this can flip off as the valve opens and closes and travel through the bloodstream to different places. So in Michael's case, a piece dislodged and went to his brain, and it developed into an abscess because it's full of bacteria.
Well, Debora was arrested on November 22nd, shortly after taking her daughter to a ballet practice. Though her attorney had requested that if arrested she be allowed to turn herself in voluntarily, the police and the district attorney felt that her behavior was too unpredictable.
Well, yeah. They've got first-hand information, first-hand knowledge of her behavior.
Well, yeah.
So
I think that was the right choice.
Yeah, who knows what would have happened.
I know. Probably worse than OJ. It'd be more than a motorcade. It'd probably be something would be set on fire, or God knows what she'd do.
Yeah.
So she was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of aggravated arson. In a press conference, the DA cited a domestic situation as the motive for her crimes. Debora was initially held in a Missouri jail and then extradited to Johnson County Adult Detention Center in Kansas, and she had a $3 million bond. That's the highest bail ever asked for in that county.
That's a big bond.
Yeah, so they had a show cause hearing in the case in January of 1996, and Debora was represented by attorneys Dennis Moore and Kevin Moriarty. Her defense claimed that the fire in the family home had been set not by Debora, but by her son Tim, who had once been caught by local police setting small fires in a neighbor's yard. So the defense was attempting to blame Mike's poisoning on Tim also, who did a lot of the cooking in the household, I guess.
I don't know if they truly believe that or they were just seeking alternative theories. It seems kind of nasty to throw your kid who's died in the fire, has no way of defending himself.
Oh, absolutely.
They threw him right under the bus.
Well, a lot of people were outraged that she was blaming her kid. It's horrible. But, people do that in situations like this. Look at Casey Anthony.
Oh, sure.
How she threw her dad under the bus.
Yeah, we'll blame somebody else. I don't care.
But that's an all-time low to blame your dead child.
I would think, yeah.
Yeah. Well, since Mike underwent surgery again in December of 1995 to treat the abscess in his brain, they were fearful that he might not survive the proceedings. And knowing that his testimony was key to their case, prosecutors videotaped his testimony. But fortunately the surgery was a success and he was able to testify in person. Under cross-examination by the defense, he admitted that both he and Debora had contributed to the problems in the couple's marriage, and that his relationship with his son had been so adversarial that they had sometimes had physical fights.
Witnesses called by the state supported Mike's and the prosecutor's earlier claims that police had been called to the home a month before the fire, that Debora's behavior had been cause for concern at the time, and that Mike had turned in to police at the time the seed packets containing castor seeds. The Earl May store clerk who had identified Debora before as the purchaser of multiple packets of castor bean seeds testified that it was her. Medical evidence was presented that Mike's illness had not fit within the parameters of any known disease, but its presentation did in fact match the symptoms of ricin poisoning. An FBI criminologist provided testimony that he had tested for ricin antibodies in Mike's blood approximately 2 months after his last acute symptoms, and found antibodies there in such large amounts that he could definitely state that Mike had been subjected to repeated exposures to ricin.
Now, a police officer also testified that as the first responder to the fire scene in the early morning of October 24th, he had found Kate Farrar to be very frantic with worry over her siblings, but that Deb Greene had showed very little concern and very little emotion. The defense argued that the psychiatric medications Debora had been taking since her September hospitalization could have caused that flat affect, which could have led police and fire personnel to see her as unemotional.
True, but that's assuming she was continuing to take her medications.
Well, yeah, and to that degree, are you going to be flat if your children are in a fire?
Right.
I think that's really a stretch of the truth. I don't think that's true. Arson investigators testified about how they had located the origin and the cause of the house fire, stressing that the multiple unconnected small fires they had found in the home's basement were evidence of the fire having been set purposely, and that char patterns on the house's floors were evidence of a liquid accelerant having been used to start the fire. So the living room floor had contained the most significant amount of accelerant, and the trail of accelerant had ended up at the door of the master bedroom, which had been open while the fire burned. So the state of the bedroom door contradicted Debora's testimony to investigators that her bedroom door had been closed and that she had only opened it briefly to look in the hallway.
Yeah, they could tell by the burn patterns on the door and on the rug where the door was open to.
Yeah.
And realized that the door had to have been opened.
Well, on the book we read about this by Anne Rule, they went over all the details of the fire investigators, and it was fascinating.
It was.
I mean, it was really, if you're a fire investigator, this was obviously arson. It was so blatant.
Yeah, the way it was written was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So detectives who had spoken to both Debora and Mike on the night of the fire also testified as to Debora's unusual demeanor during the interview. A videotape of the questioning was played, including Debora's statements about having urged Tim to stay in the burning house, and her references to her children in the past tense.
Very strange interview, which is available on YouTube, but also just in the introduction of this episode, you can hear a few of her phrases and how strange she sounds. She doesn't sound like someone who's really devastated or upset.
No.
She sounds kind of fake.
And again, she's referring to her children in the past tense, and at that point hadn't even known that they were dead.
Well, she had a pretty good idea, because they were trapped in there.
Hadn't been told by the police that the kids were dead.
Right.
Yeah, she knew they were dead.
Sure she did. The defense testimony focused on the theory that Tim, angry at his father, had set fire to the home. So friends of Tim's were brought in to testify that Tim had had a fascination with fire and that he had told friends that he knew how to make bombs. A neighbor testified that he had once caught Tim burning some grass in the neighbor's yard. A former nanny testified that she had heard Tim speak about wanting his father dead and planning to burn down the family's house, and had caught him multiple times setting, or with the implements to set, fires. So on cross-examination, she admitted that she had not seen Tim for years, and agreed that she had not reported Tim's fascination with fire to his parents or to the police back when she supposedly saw it. So she hadn't taken care of him since he was 8 or 9 years old.
Right.
Now the defense rested on February 1st, and the presiding judge ruled that probable cause had been shown to hold Debora for trial, and her arraignment date was set for February 8th, with her trial being projected to start that summer. Because the crime involved more than one victim, the prosecutors decided to request the death penalty when the case went to trial. Now, when faced with this possibility, Debora's defense team brought in Sean O'Brien, who was a representative of the Missouri Anti-Capital Punishment Group.
He's an attorney also. So then there's a series of legal maneuverings involving both sides that took place in the late winter and early spring of 1996. The defense attorneys requested cameras be barred from the trial, but that request was rejected. Debora was judged by court-appointed psychologists as competent to stand trial. And then the presiding judge ruled that she would stand trial once for all the charges against her rather than be tried separately on each charge.
Now her defense team undertook its own investigation, hoping to disprove state witnesses' testimony that identified the fire as arson, and they found that accelerant had indeed been used to stoke the fire, and also they found a robe of Debora's had been on the floor of the master bedroom, and it was burned in such a way that it looked like it was being worn by someone when the fire was started. So according to Debora's friend and divorce attorney Ellen Ryan, when she was confronted with this evidence, Debora did admit to setting the fire that destroyed her home, but then she denied any memory of the event. She continued to claim that Tim had been the one who poisoned his father, and then she agreed to an Alford plea of no contest.
So in the Alford plea is where you know that the evidence is overwhelming against you.
Correct, yes.
And you take a plea.
But you don't really have to admit that you did it.
Right.
Right. So on April 13th, the defense team notified the prosecutor that Debora wanted to plea bargain. On April 17th, the plea was made public when Debora appeared in court to plead no contest to 5 charges. So that was 2 counts of capital murder, 1 of arson, and 2 of attempted first-degree murder. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, The no contest plea called for her to accept a prison sentence of a minimum of 40 years without any possibility of parole. And she denied being under the influence of any drugs, which would have infected her judgment when she made that plea.
Then, after listening to a reading of the prosecution's case against her, Debora read a statement to the court. And in this statement, she said that she understood that the state had, quote, substantial evidence, unquote, that she had caused her children's death, and that though her attorneys were prepared to provide evidence that she had not been in control of herself at the time of the children's deaths, she was choosing not to contest the state's evidence in the hope that the end of the case would allow her family, especially her surviving daughter, to begin to heal. In a subsequent press conference, defense counsel told reporters she is accepting responsibility for the crimes, but said that I don't think she ever intended to kill her children.
Well, I think the evidence goes against that, the way the fire was set to trap them in their rooms.
Sure sounds like it. And then she told the son, stay put.
I know, that's heartbreaking.
And the one child who did survive, she told to jump, and she didn't try to catch her.
I know. Do you think she just did that? She thought maybe she'd die when she hit the ground?
I think so.
She's evil.
That's my interpretation anyway.
Well, and then she continues to blame Tim for the poisoning, so I really don't feel like she felt sorry.
No.
She was formally sentenced on May 30th, 1996, and that was following testimony by the psychologist who had ruled on her competency. So according to the psychologist, Debora was immature and lacked the adult-level ability to cope with emotion. Debora read another statement to the court, and she was sentenced to 2 concurrent 40-year prison sentences, minus the 191 days she'd already served. So she's in the Topeka Correctional Facility serving her sentence, and her earliest possible release date is November 21st, 2035, and at that time she'd be 84 years old, so pretty old woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she's going to serve 40 or 39 and a half years, because it's 40 minus the 190 days already
it's
served.
A long time, till 2035.
That's a pretty good sentence.
Yeah.
Now, after the sentencing, Debora continued to maintain that her recall of the night of the fire was limited. In the summer of 1996, she wrote to her daughter, claiming that she had taken more than the recommended doses of her medications that night. Similar letters to her ex-husband Michael varied from claims that she had no recollection of the night to firmly stating that she was innocent of the arson. She theorized that Margaret Hacker had set fire to the family's house and repeated her claim from the show cause hearing that Tim had been the one to poison his father. She doesn't sound like she's accepting guilt too well.
No, and I really don't feel sorry for her because she keeps blaming her child.
Yeah, that's just nasty stuff.
It is. So Debora actually wrote to the author Anne Rule in 1996, and she asserted that due to alcohol abuse, she'd not had the mental capacity to start a fire. In a later interview with Anne Rule, she blamed her cloudy thinking during the court hearings on her Prozac prescription and stated that once she was off the drug, her mind became much clearer. So in 2000, with a new legal team, Debora filed a request for a new trial, and this was on the basis of having been rendered incompetent by the psychiatric medications she was taking at the time. She alleged that her original attorneys had failed to represent her adequately, instead focusing on avoiding a trial and the death penalty. So she withdrew the request, though, when prosecutors determined that they would seek the death penalty if a new trial was awarded. So she still wasn't willing to take that chance.
Apparently not.
No.
You know, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. I mean, I want a retrial because of inadequate representation.
Yes.
Oh, but wait a minute. You're going to go for the death penalty?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind.
Because she knows there's a pretty good chance she would lose.
There's a very good chance she could lose.
But then in 2004, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional. So Debora came back again and filed a second request for a new trial. And her attorneys claimed that new scientific techniques invalidated the evidence that the fire had been caused by arson. And that request was denied also.
Well, I think there were fire inspectors called by both sides, or investigated by both sides, and everyone came up with a conclusion that it was arson.
Yeah, there was really no way to say it wasn't.
Anyone saying it wasn't arson.
No, like I said, it was very obvious arson. There were pour patterns from pouring the accelerant.
There were.
Yeah.
So the request for retrial was denied.
So I just wonder what was going on in her mind. You know, there have been multiple sources that have attempted to classify her pathology and her motivation for committing these crimes. And during her sentencing hearing, Marilyn Hutchinson, a psychologist hired by the defense, had testified about her mental state. And this is when she characterized her as cognitively competent and capable of controlling her emotion at a basic level, but she noted that Debora appeared to be lacking in emotion beyond the level of basic competence. They said she was prone to monosyllabic answers during the interviews and described herself as tuning out to avoid excessive emotion. Hutchinson's also described an affidavit from the doctor who had treated Debora during her commitment to the Menninger Clinic, and that reported that she'd been admitted on the basis of having either major or bipolar depression. Evaluations at the clinic showed Debora to be minimally able to cope with the world, and her treating physician reported that she'd been found to have the emotional capabilities of a very young child. So Hutchinson's diagnosis was schizoid personality disorder. Her opinion was that Debora's intelligence had allowed her to compensate for her limited emotional ability in her day-to-day life, but that the stressors of her impending divorce had overwhelmed her ability to compensate. So she denied that Debora Green was a sociopath.
Okay. I mean, this is a trained psychologist,
So I take that for what it is.
I'll go with that.
The emotional immaturity, I could definitely see those letters she was writing, the way she stomped around and threw things.
Yeah, spitting at her husband.
Yeah.
Or ex-husband.
Talking to her children the way she did, which was so inappropriate.
So Arthur Ann Rule began corresponding with Debora Green in 1996.
Yeah, that was after Debora had contacted her.
And interviewed her in person in 1997. She wrote in her book on the case, Bitter Harvest, that Debora's letters denied any unhappy childhood memories. Debora claimed that though her behavior in the summer and fall of 1995 had been negligent and neglectful, she had neither the desire nor the wherewithal to set fire to her house or harm her children or harm her husband.
Yeah, Deadly Women, a true crime documentary show that focuses on crimes committed by women, did feature her case also in a 2010 episode that was made about women who kill their children. And she looked like terrible in that one. Of course, they make them all out to be real demons, but...
Yeah, it's all black or all white in those shows.
It is. But, I mean, she was pretty black, wouldn't you say?
Very.
Yeah.
There ain't no gray.
No, she was pretty bad.
There was a 2002 working paper on bioterrorism, which was intended to enable policymakers concerned with bioterrorism to make more informed decisions. Included the Debora Green case in a survey of illegal uses of biological agents. Paper noted that she had refused to provide any detail on the manner in which she extracted and administered the ricin she used against her husband.
Right.
But remember, way back in college, she's a chemistry major.
Yeah.
So she probably could easily refresh herself and figure out how to do that.
It wouldn't be that hard to extract it.
No.
And he said he could taste it, so it's not like it was that subtly done.
Well, at least the one time. The chicken salad sandwich tasted bitter.
Well, we don't know what she did to him the first time because she hadn't bought those packets until after the first time he got sick.
All those packets. I mean, she might have bought packets from somewhere else.
Absolutely, she might have.
Just did a test run or two.
Yeah, we just don't know.
No.
That's all. Yeah. All right, let's take a minute to talk about what's happening at Tie Grabber, and then we'll get to our feedback section, okay?
Okay.
So we had a change on September 1st for new subscribers, and we just have 2 levels of payment now, $3 a month and $5 a month. So that's a little bit different, but our $3 a month subscribers will still get a bottle opener, and our $5 a month subscribers will still receive a snifter, but both of those categories also includes a TCB sticker now, so everybody gets a sticker. Now, there's no need to worry if you're already a $2 a month subscriber, because all of our $2 a month people have been grandfathered in, and will stay at the $2 for the foreseeable future. We've got no plans to change that.
Right. It's just the new subscribers won't find any $2 subscription.
That's right. So speaking of Team Tie Grabber, we have the 3rd episode in our series on O.J. Simpson, released 2 weeks ago, and the 4th episode is in the works now. So suggestions for what to do next for our members-only episode are definitely encouraged. We have lots of suggestions here.
Don't we?
But what I'm trying to do is like put them in categories, and then the one that we get the most suggestions for wins. So it's kind of like taking a vote.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, if you haven't joined TieGrabber, it's a very easy thing to do. Just go to tiegrabber.com/Team Perks and sign up with PayPal. We also have a brewery shop there where you can purchase t-shirts, snifters, bottle openers, and coasters. And there's also an absolutely free way to give us some support. The next time you need to shop at Amazon, go in through the link on our website, tiegrabber.com. And if you go into Amazon that way, we're going to get a little kickback from Amazon on your purchases. So these are things you're going to buy anyway. And we won't know what you bought, and the prices won't be any different. It's just a great little extra click you do to help us out. If you have feedback for us, you can contact us at truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, on Twitter at tiegrabberpods, on Instagram at tiegrabberpodcasts, and also on Facebook. Many of our listeners are on the True Crime Brewery discussions group, where you can chat about cases we've covered, cases you'd like us to cover, or just true crime in general. It's a great place to give us some constructive criticism and suggestions also. And as always, anything you do to support us is appreciated very much. We also have another podcast out there called Watching ID, where we watch a show on the Investigation Discovery Channel, so it's a true crime show, and then we talk about it. And that's called Watching ID. You can also get that on iTunes or on our website. And what we have coming up this week is Grave Mysteries.
Grave somethings.
Grave Mysteries.
Mysteries. I can never remember that second word.
I know. It's a new show on Investigation Discovery, and we're going to do the first episode this week. See how we like it. We haven't seen it yet either, but it looks pretty good.
Well, we'll check it out.
Yeah, we will. Okay, let's just have a little bit of music and get to the feedback.
Okay.
I've been reading books of old, the legends and the myths, Achilles and his gold, Hercules and his gifts, Spider-Man's control, and Batman with his fists. And clearly I don't see my fifth upon that list. She said, where'd you wanna go? How much you wanna risk? I'm not looking for somebody with some superhuman gifts, some superhero, some fairy tale bliss. Just something I can turn to, somebody I can kiss. I want something just like this. Do-do-do-do-do-do.
Welcome to Feedback. So I have an email suggestion from Rochelle, and she says, I wonder if you ever considered covering Oba Chandler and how he lured a mother and her 2 teenage daughters onto a boat in the Gulf of Mexico for a sunset cruise. They were on vacation in Florida and met him while they were seeking directions. After he conned them onto the boat, he bound and gagged them, sexually assaulted them, and tied cement blocks to each one. One by one, he dropped them in the dark ocean water. He intentionally left their eyes uncovered so they would have to watch the others as they were being thrown into the ocean at night. This crime has always haunted me.
We saw that.
We did see that on a show.
Yeah, I forget what show.
Yep.
But I remember that very well.
It's a horrible crime.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and he was actually executed. I just looked it up to get a little info. So he was executed in June 1989 for the triple murders of Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters. Their bodies were found with their hands and feet bound, floating in Tampa Bay, Florida. Autopsies showed the victims had been thrown into the water while still alive, with ropes around their necks with a concrete block tied to either end of the rope. The case became high profile in 1992 when local police posted on billboards enlarged copies of the suspect's handwriting recovered on a pamphlet in the victim's car. Chandler was identified as the killer when his neighbor recognized the handwriting. So this was the first use of billboards like that by law enforcement in the U.S. So yeah, that is interesting. I do remember seeing a show on it, and there's a ton of information online, so I think we might do it, but it's just so horrible. I just keep thinking about it.
It's such a brutal.
If they had to watch their mother or their daughter go into the ocean like that.
Well, they probably had to watch them being raped.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. I don't know if we're going to do that. I can understand why Rochelle is haunted by it. That's a heartbreaker.
It is.
Yeah. But I'm going to keep it in my pile here, and maybe we'll do it someday.
Okay. We'll keep it in the maybe pile.
Okay.
So I have a suggestion from Ashley on Facebook, who wants to look into the death of Jessica Johnson in Horn Lake, Mississippi. So they found her, or a mail carrier found this woman, hanging from a mailbox by shoestrings that had been fashioned into a noose.
I don't understand how that's possible.
Well, and to Jessica's family and friends, it's an absurd theory. And they say that she was murdered. And if you think about it, that's not the way you're going to kill yourself, by hanging.
I wouldn't think so. I don't even know how it's possible to do that.
No.
But she had bruises and things on other parts of her body.
She did.
Like maybe she'd been strangled by someone or tied up.
There was a lot of evidence that it wasn't a death by suicide.
Yeah.
But they haven't charged anybody with it.
No, they haven't, because they've ruled it a suicide. So it would need to be reopened, I believe.
So first they have to reopen it, but they haven't shown any inclination to do that yet.
Not that I know of, no.
That would be an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, I think we'll look at it and maybe keep an eye on it. And if anything else comes up with it, if they do decide to open the case or charge someone. So I'm going to put that in our maybe pile also.
Okay, 2 maybes.
Okay, so I have a suggestion from Chuck. And Chuck says, just came across a bizarre crime story. The Bone Breaker.
The Bone Breaker.
The Bone Breaker. You do better with that. You may want to look into it for an episode. Murderpedia has a write-up. It's Joe Clark. And one of his victims was Tad Phillips. Truly bizarre story. So I haven't read the whole story, but I did go to Murderpedia and print that. And it seems like he was a teenager. Joe Clark was a teenager in Wisconsin, and he would torture boys. He killed some boys, like a 14-year-old and another teenager. So I'm not sure about the whole story, but I am going to read it. So I just wanted to let Chuck know I'm going to read it, and it's going to go in the maybe pile also.
Okay.
But it does seem like it's pretty complicated, and this was a real sick guy. I mean, at 17, he was doing some horrible shit.
It sounds like a real sicko.
Yeah.
Okay, I have an email suggestion from Stephanie. She says, my husband Bob and I love your show and listen every week. I'm wondering about the case of George Smith and would enjoy hearing it covered on your show. This occurred back in 2007. He was on his honeymoon with his wife Jennifer on a European cruise. They were drinking and partying. When George went back to his room later that night, he was never seen again. Witnesses said they heard a loud thud in the early morning hours, and Jennifer was later found passed out in another room. He was last seen talking with some gentlemen earlier that night in the casino, but it remains unsolved to this day.
Now, I think I saw a 2020 or something about that one, too.
I think we've seen something about this.
Yeah.
So they were on their honeymoon on a 2-week trip on a Mediterranean cruise, stopping in Greece, Turkey, and Italy, among other locations. So he mysteriously disappeared one night or early morning. Evidence suggested that foul play might have been involved because they found bloodstains in his cabin and the side of the ship.
Well, I think they were out partying really late, which, that's what you do on a cruise ship, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, and she was found passed out in someone else's room.
Yeah, and there were some guys, I'm just vaguely remembering the show I saw about it. There were some guys with him or something, so.
Yeah, he was with, Geraldo did a news story.
Okay.
Interviewed one of the people who was last seen with him, along with 2 guys that were of Russian origin, but no one's been charged. In June of 2006, the Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines agreed to pay compensation to Smith's estate.
Well, big deal, really.
Yeah.
That doesn't really help them much.
So
he's gone.
There's some question whether it was a death because of a robbery gone bad, but we don't know.
Well, from what I remember of it, they really had a lot to drink. They were really out of it.
They were really crushed.
And I think it seems like someone took advantage of him, maybe her also. But there was some suspicion about her, wasn't there?
There was.
Yeah.
She was criticized by some people because of her conduct on the night of her disappearance.
Of his disappearance.
Of his disappearance.
Yeah. Yeah, because she was, she was partying and stuff, but it seems like, didn't she act strangely afterwards?
She did.
Yeah.
But nothing ever happened, and she actually got compensation of $1.1 million from Royal Caribbean. But Smith's family challenged the terms of the settlement, as well as the amount of monetary compensation. So that's in the courts right now, or has been in the courts.
So did his family think she had something to do with it? Were they against her? Or?
They think that there was more to it than she was speaking about.
So they think she wasn't telling the whole story.
Right.
Okay.
So that looks pretty interesting.
It does. The very first episode we ever did, that Amy Lynn Bradley.
That was a cruise ship.
Which is, we can't listen to it. It's painful to listen to. But That was quite a story.
First-time jitters.
Yeah, that was a tough story, and it seems like if you want to get away with something, making someone disappear,
do it on a cruise ship.
The cruise ship is the place to do it.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, maybe they have more cameras now, but it seems like you can get away with a lot on a cruise ship.
I would think that'd be one of the solutions, would be to put a bunch of cameras.
I would think so, but
because then you can't talk about how you were so drunk and your husband just went overboard because of his drunken stupor.
Right. Well, I mean, we don't have any evidence that she did anything.
Right.
Right. But it just seems like you could get pushed over and nobody would know. And let's be honest, these cruise ships are not well known for their safety and their keeping things on the up and up. I mean, there's been so many bad stories of cruise ship incidents.
Yeah. And not just epidemics of infection.
No, that's one thing, though.
But more than that.
More than that, yeah. Safety things. I think there have been quite a few rapes on cruise ships by people who work for the cruise lines. Because people come from all over the world. And on the waters, right, they're not always under a certain jurisdiction. So it's all very tricky.
It is.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, you're on a cruise, you're relaxing, you're probably drinking too much, inhibitions are lowered.
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of bad things that can happen.
Yeah. That's why we don't go on cruises. Okay, I have an email, or actually it's a Facebook posting from Lilia, and it is regarding Cooper Harris, the child who died in the hot car, and how his father, Ross Harris, was found guilty on kind of not a lot of evidence, right?
Right.
Right.
We felt like the jury didn't like him particularly well.
Well, she talks about all that, so let me read it first, then you can talk about it.
Let's read about what Lilia says.
She wrote a great letter about it. I was absolutely shocked after listening to your episode regarding the death of Cooper Harris and learning that his father was found guilty for his death. I agree with your comments on Ross's character and his extramarital exploits, but as you and I both know, being a shitty husband does not make you a murderer. The fact that the prosecution relied so heavily on presenting the absolute worst image of Ross as possible, bringing up things that had nothing to do with the crime for which he was charged, really underscores for me the fact that their case against him was extremely weak. I'm honestly very upset and distressed that a person can be sentenced to life in prison, if not death, on the basis of acting weirdly after learning of their child's death and of being a bad husband. When you think about it, that's the whole case. His social media messages never alluded to wanting his kid dead. The prosecution completely distorted every single thing in this case. The female police officer's testimony basically proves that Ross Harris was presumed guilty from the get-go. Commenting on his Will Ferrell-like scream at the scene was so unprofessional of her. This is a father whose kid just died. Whether she personally believed him, that he did it or not, she has no right airing such a biased personal statement to the jury. She immediately is linking this pivotal moment to something ridiculous. I mean, I agree that he behaved oddly at the scene. He would have forgotten his son so quickly in the car, but are we really ready to convict him of malice murder based on these things? The police's theory of him going back to the car is really about him wanting to return to the scene of the crime has no basis in my opinion. Offenders who visit crime scenes to relive the crimes have some sadism in them, and as we know, there is no history of abuse and no previous or recent injuries were found on Cooper's body. There is no evidence of Ross having any kind of pathology to support this theory. I agree with Jill's comments on how Ross not mentioning certain things during the police interview could be seen as suspicious, but then I realized that's because we're working from the presumption of guilt. If we look at these things from the presumption of innocence, as police should have, then it becomes completely understandable that after learning you had caused your baby's death, intentionally or not, in that state of mind, you might forget mentioning a few things. Because we need to remember that this is not a case of a parent learning that their child is dead. He's finding out that he caused it and that it's his fault. I think many people view his odd behavior from this mistaken point of view and fail to account for him knowing he caused it. Maybe I'm missing something, but after learning about this case, I'm so relieved we don't have a jury system in Iceland, my country. As a law student, I think my faith in the law would be severely affected if we were to have juries because of what this case, the case in the Anthony trial, and the O.J. trial, and many other cases have taught me is that trusting juries to apply the law regarding the guilt or innocence of a defendant often results in great injustice. Looking at the whole case against Ross Harris, I'd say the evidence points to him being about 30 to 40% guilty, which is absolutely not enough to convict someone in a criminal trial. For me, this whole case has been a waste of valuable court resources and time that could have been spent trying to send some worthy people to prison, people who actually commit crimes and need to be removed from society at large and hopefully rehabilitated.
A thoughtful letter.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of it. What do you think?
Yeah, well, we talked about this when we did the podcast, that different jurisdictions approach hot car deaths differently.
Yes.
So he was in Georgia and get charged. He might have been in Pennsylvania and not been charged.
Well, you wouldn't even have to be in another state. It was kind of based on what the prosecutor wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
That was one thing we talked about.
I guess he could have been in another jurisdiction in Georgia.
Exactly. Yeah, and there have been different people with very similar cases who are treated very differently.
Exactly.
And I think she's definitely right on about them putting such an emphasis on his texting women and cheating on his wife. It really is irrelevant.
It is. But I'd be looking, when he did get convicted, that he backed the car into the parking spot. And the thought is that he could have seen the child still in the car at that point.
I get that, but it really isn't beyond a reasonable doubt, though.
No, but I'm just saying.
Okay.
And he went to the car to toss in the light bulbs he purchased at lunchtime and would have had the opportunity to see his child in the car then.
Well, what a lot of our listeners have written, and what I have also thought about, with their help, I guess, is that the wife believed him. And I'm sure she loved her son, so if she doesn't think he did it, I think that gives us a big sign. If the wife had thought he did it, or if he'd said things even about killing his son or been abusive in some way. But there really was none of that.
Well, no. But what did she say when she first saw him? When she first saw him in jail, she said, "What did you say to them?" Or
did you say too much?
Did you say too much?
But that could mean that she thinks he's incriminating himself when he didn't do anything because they said he was kind of a weird talker.
Okay.
I mean, this could all be interpreted in different ways.
Or she knew what was going on and she said,
or that.
So, yeah, there's definitely nuances to this case.
Yeah.
And I think Lilia said 30 to 40% possibility or probability.
Yeah.
Probably say 50 to 60%.
But still not enough to convict him, right?
Well, I don't think so. I think there's probably enough evidence that they did convict him.
So you're okay with it?
Not totally.
No. Well, you're kind of on the fence. You're not giving me a real answer of how you feel about it.
I'm a fence sitter.
Yeah. All right. Well, what do you think about the whole jury system thing? That was an interesting thing she added, that in Iceland they don't have the jury system, and she's glad because she doesn't trust juries. Now, we've presented cases where the jury did suck, in my opinion, but it doesn't mean that they generally suck, does it? What do you think?
No, it doesn't, but you're asking basically lay people to give judgments, as she said in her letter, give judgments on matters of law.
Yeah.
So
it's iffy.
Maybe we should have bench trials for everybody.
Well, then, though, my problem there is then you have to trust those judges. They have to be wise judges. And I'm sure not all judges are wise.
No.
So that's the thing. I mean, either way, you have to trust someone's judgment. And I could see how a judge is trained in the law, and maybe they are more trustworthy than a jury. And it seems like once you get involved with a jury trial, you're in more of a performance by the lawyers. It's not as much about the laws, it's more about how you can make the person look. And if the jury likes the lawyer, even. There's a lot of little things that go into it that have nothing to do with whether the person's innocent or guilty.
There are. There's too many possibilities that are sitting out there.
Yeah, but I don't know if I could trust the judge either. So then you just have one person making this determination, and what if he has some kind of bias?
Well, then
or she has some kind of bias.
Maybe we should have a 3-panel.
Or just go to the Supreme Court type of thing.
Yeah.
But there's bias everywhere.
Do that.
Yeah, I know.
But maybe instead of, if you did away with juries, instead we'll have a 3-person panel.
But then you're still picking people off the street, right?
No.
Oh, 3-judge panel.
3-judge panel.
Yeah, maybe. But it does make you think about the jury system, these cases, absolutely.
Yeah, well, We could cover that in a whole topic. That'd be something fun to discuss one of these days.
Yeah, and we've been tough on juries. Gotten a lot of feedback about how we've come down on juries, but
well,
I really have not been impressed with many of them.
No.
No.
Because when you get down to it, who wants to serve on a jury? Particularly on a case that can linger on forever. So you have a job, and you're suddenly going to spend the next 2 months listening to testimonies. People that have more time on their hands are more able to serve on a jury.
Right. So
for whatever reason.
So what does that say about it, though? Is that a bad thing, you're saying?
Well, it can be.
It can be. Right. Okay. Let's go to the next letter. I know you have one more.
I have one more. Is this our last one?
Yes.
Okay, this is from Jennifer. She's given a hint to take a look at Lisa, I guess Liysa. I'll say Lisa Northen, who killed her husband. Anne Rule wrote a book called Heart Full of Lies about the case. And Jennifer feels that Anne Rule gave a slightly biased account. She seemed to be in a lot of disconnect about how she described Lisa Northen and the alleged personality disorder that Lisa supposedly had. So she was sentenced to prison for killing her husband in a northeastern Oregon campground. She served 12 years and has been released.
So she was released early for some reason?
Well, let's see. She pleaded guilty in July 2001 to first-degree manslaughter in the October 9th, 2000 shooting death of her husband.
So did she say it was self-defense or something?
She pled guilty. She didn't say anything. She was known as Surfer to the other prisoners, and she became the villain of Anne Rule's bestseller, Heart Full of Lies. The case landed back in the spotlight in July 2011 when a freelance writer did a cover story defending Lisa Northen and slamming Anne Rule in her book. The story rebounded embarrassingly when it came out that the author had neglected to mention that he and Northen fell in love while he was writing it.
Oh, geez. That's interesting.
Well, maybe there's a little bias there, huh?
Wow.
So she said she was a domestic violence victim in fear of her life when she killed Chris Northen, her husband. Theo is a pilot for Hawaiian Airlines, but he allegedly led a double life as a violent, high-functioning alcoholic and drug addict. Denzel.
Yeah, sounds a little bit like the movie Flight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Although he didn't get killed.
No.
All right, well.
So that looks
that's
interesting. Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for the feedback, and keep it coming. You can write to us at truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com. You can also put your feedback in on Twitter or Facebook, and I do read it all. I'm not able to get it all on the air, but we do read it all, and we try and talk about as many as we can.
We do. And just one quickie thing, if I may. I really like Lilia's letter. I'd love to learn more about jurisprudence in Iceland. She's a law student. Maybe she'll write us again.
Yeah, that would be great.
And tell us how things really work over there. I'd be very, very interested in hearing from her again.
But yeah, that would be fun to hear a little bit more about how it works there.
Yeah, I mean, her letter was a very well-written, thought-provoking letter, and I'd like to hear more from her.
Well, it seems like she was really upset about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's good when someone has a passion about something and they write to us that they're really passionate about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. This is probably the longest podcast ever.
I think we've taken up enough of these people's time.
All right, let's let them go.
Okay, you're free to leave now, folks.
See you at the quiet end. Bye-bye.
Next time.